all sufficient, and contain within themselves the groundwork of all knowledge concerning them. Man as mind is subject to change. He is not something made and finally complete, but has within him the capacity for progress. By the universal law of evolution, he has become what he is and is becoming that which he will be. His being is modified by every thought he thinks. Every experience affects his character. Every effort he makes changes his mentality. Herein is the secret of man's degradation and also of his power and salvation if he but utilize this law of change in the right choice of thought. To live is to think and act is to change. While man is ignorant of the nature of thought, he continues to change for better or worse. But being acquainted with the nature of thought, he intelligently accelerates and directs the process of change, and only for the better. What the sum total of a man's thoughts are, that he is. From the sameness of thought with man, there is not the slightest fractional deviation. There is a change of result with the addition and subtraction of thought, but the mathematical law is an invariable quantity. Seeing that man is mind, that mind is composed of thought, and that thought is subject to change, it follows that to deliberately change the thought is to change the man. All religions work upon the heart, the thought of man, with the object of directing it into purer and higher channels. And success in this direction, whether partial or complete, is called salvation. That is, deliverance from one kind of thought, one condition of mind, by the substitution of another thought, another condition. It is true that the dispensers of religion today do not know this because of the hypothetical veil which intervenes between the fact and their consciousness. But they do it without knowing it. And the great teachers who founded the various religions built upon this fact as their precepts plainly show. The chief things upon which these teachers lay such stress and so constantly reiterate, such as the purification of the heart, the thinking of right thoughts, and the doing of good deeds. What are they but calls to a higher, nobler mode of thought-energizing forces, urging men in the choosing of thoughts which shall lift them into realms of greater power, greater good, greater bliss? Aspiration, meditation, devotion. These are the chief means which men in all ages employ to reach up to higher modes of thought, wide airs of peace, vaster realms of knowledge. For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. He is saved from himself, from his own folly and suffering, by creating within new habits of thoughts, by becoming a new thinker, a new man. Should a man by a supreme effort succeed in thinking as Jesus thought, not by imitation, but by a sudden realization of his indwelling power, he would be as Jesus. In the Buddhistic records, there is an instance of a man, not the possessor of great piety or wisdom, who asked Buddha how one might attain the highest wisdom and enlightenment. And Buddha replied, by ceasing from all desire. And it is recorded that the man let go all personal desires, and at once realized the highest wisdom and enlightenment. One of the sayings of Buddha runs, the only miracle with which a wise man concerns himself is the transformation of a sinner into a saint. And Emerson referred to this transforming power of change of thought when he said, it is as easy to be great as to be small, which is closely akin to that other great and oft-repeated but little understood saying, be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. And after all, what is the fundamental difference between a great man and a small one? It is one of thought, of mental attitude. True, it is one of knowledge, but then knowledge cannot be separated from thought, and every substitution of a better for a worse thought is a transforming agency which marks an important advance in knowledge. Throughout the whole range of human life, from the lowest savage to the highest type of man, thought determines character, condition, knowledge. The mass of humanity moves slowly along the evolutionary path, urged by the blind impulse of its dominant thoughts as they are stimulated and called forth by external things. But the true thinker, the sage, travels swiftly and intelligently along a chosen path of his own. The multitudes unenlightened concerning their spiritual nature are the slaves of thought, but the sage is the master of thought. They follow blindly, he chooses intelligently. They obey the impulse of the moment, thinking of their immediate pleasure and happiness. He commands and subdues impulse, resting upon that which is permanently right. They, obeying blind impulse, violate the law of righteousness. He, conquering impulse, obeys the law of righteousness. The sage stands face to face with the facts of life. He knows the nature of thought. He understands and obeys the law of his being. But the sorrow-burdened victim of blind impulse can open his mental eyes and see the true nature of things when he wishes to do so. The sage, intelligent, radiant, calm, and the fool, confused, darkened, disturbed, are one in essence, and are divided only by the nature of their thoughts. When the fool turns away from and abandons his foolish thoughts and chooses and adopts wise thoughts, lo, he becomes a sage. Socrates saw the essential oneness of virtue and knowledge, and so every sage sees. Learning may aid and accompany wisdom, but does not lead to it. Only the choosing of wise thoughts, and necessarily the doing of wise deeds, leads to wisdom. A man may be learned in the schools, but foolish in the school of life. Not the committing of words to memory, but the establishing oneself in purer thoughts, nobler thinking, leads to the peace-giving revelations of true knowledge. Folly and wisdom, ignorance and enlightenment are not merely the result of thought, they are thought itself. Both causes and effect, effort and result, are contained in thought. All that we are is the result of what we have thought. It is founded on our thoughts. It is made up of our thoughts. Man is not a being possessing a soul, another self. He himself is a soul. He himself is the thinker and doer, actor and knower. His composite mentality is himself. His spiritual nature is rounded by his sphere of thought. He it is that desires and sorrows, enjoys and suffers, loves and hates. The mind is not the instrument of a metaphysical superhuman soul. Mind is soul, mind is being, mind is men. Man can find himself, he can see himself as he is. When he is prepared to turn from the illusory and self-created world of hypothesis in which he wanders, and to stand face to face with actuality, then will be known himself as he is. Moreover, he can picture himself as he would wish to be, and can create within him the new thinker, the new man, for every moment is the time of choice, and every hour is destiny. Light on the law of cause and effect in human life. How frequently people associate the word law with hardness and cruelty. It seems to embody for them nothing but an inflexible tyranny. This arises partly from their inability to perceive principles apart from persons, and partly from the idea that the office of law is solely to punish. Viewed from such an attitude of mind, the term law is hazily regarded as some sort of indefinite personality whose business is to hunt transgressors and crush them with overwhelming punishments. Now, while law punishes, its primary office is to protect. Even the laws which man makes are framed by him to protect himself from his own baser passions. The law of our country is instituted for the protection of life and property, and it only comes into operation as a punishing factor when it is violated. Offenders against it probably think of it as cruel, and doubtless regard it with terror, but to them that obey it, it is an abiding protector and friend, and can hold for them no terror. So with the divine law, which is the stay of the universe, the heart and life of the cosmos, it is that which protects and upholds, and it is no less protective in its penalties than in its peaceful blessings. It is indeed an eternal protection which is never for one moment withheld, and it shields all beings against themselves by bringing all violations of itself, whether ignorant or willful, through pain to nothingness. Law cannot be partial. It is an unvarying mode of action, disobeying which we are hurt. Obeying, we are made happy. Neither protestation nor supplication can alter it. For if it could be altered or annulled, the universe would collapse and chaos would prevail. It is not less kind that we should suffer the penalty of our wrongdoing than that we should enjoy the blessedness of our right doing. If we could escape the effects of our ignorance and sin, all security would be gone and there would be no refuge, for we could then be equally doubtful of the result of our wisdom and goodness. Such a scheme would be one of caprice and cruelty, whereas law is a method of justice and kindness. Indeed, the supreme law is the principle of eternal kindness, faultless in working and infinite in application. It is none other than that eternal love, forever full, forever flowing free, of which the Christian sings, and the boundless compassion of Buddhistic precepts and poetry. The law which punishes us is the law which preserves us. When in their ignorance men would destroy themselves, its everlasting arms are thrown about them in loving, albeit sometimes painful protection. Every pain we suffer brings us nearer to the knowledge of the divine wisdom. Every blessing we enjoy speaks to us of the perfection of the great law and of the fullness of bliss that shall be man's when he has come to his heritage of divine knowledge. We progress by learning, and we learn up to a certain point by suffering. When the heart is mellowed by love, the law of love is perceived in all its wonderful kindness. When wisdom is acquired, peace is assured. We cannot alter the law of things, which is of sublime perfection, but we can alter ourselves so as to comprehend more and more of that perfection and make its grandeur ours. To wish to bring down the perfect to the imperfect is the height of folly, but to strive to bring the imperfect up to the perfect is the height of wisdom. Seers of the cosmos do not mourn over the scheme of things. They see the universe as a perfect whole and not as an imperfect jumble of parts. The great teachers are men of abiding joy and heavenly peace. The blind captive of unholy desire may cry, "Ah, love, could you and I with him conspire to grasp this sorry scheme of things entire? Would we not shatter it to bits and then remold it nearer to the heart's desire?" This is the wish of the voluptuary, the wish to enjoy unlawful pleasures to any extent and not reap any painful consequences. It is such men who regard the universe as a sorry scheme of things. They want the universe to bend to their will and desire, want lawlessness, not law, but the wise man bends his will and subjects his desires to the divine order, and he sees the universe as the glorious perfection of an infinitude of parts. Buddha always referred to the moral law of the universe as the good law, and indeed it is not rightly perceived if it is thought of as anything but good. For in it there can be no grain of evil, no element of unkindness. It is no iron-hearted monster crushing the weak and destroying the ignorant, but a soothing love and brooding compassion, shielding the tenderest from harm and protecting the strongest from a too destructive use of their strength. It destroys all evil. It preserves all good. It enfolds the tiniest seedling in its care, and it destroys the most colossal wrong with a breath. To perceive it is the beatific vision. To know it is the beatific bliss. And they who perceive and know it are at peace. They are glad forevermore. Such is the law which moves to righteousness, which none at last can turn aside or stay. The heart of it is love, the end of it is peace and consummation sweet, obey. Light on values, spiritual and material. It is an old-time axiom that everything has its price. Everybody knows this commercially, but how few know it spiritually. Business consists of a mutual interchange of equitable values. The customer gives money and receives goods, and the merchant gives goods and receives money. This method is universal and is regarded by all as just. In spiritual things, the method is the same, but the form of interchange is different. For material things, a material thing is given in exchange, but for spiritual things, a spiritual thing is given in exchange. Now, these two forms of exchange cannot be transposed. They are of reverse natures and remain eternally separate. Thus, a man may take a sovereign to a shop and ask for £1 worth of food or clothing or literature, and he will receive goods to the value of his sovereign. But if he were to take a sovereign to a teacher of truth and ask to be supplied with £1 worth of religion or righteousness or wisdom, he would be told that those things cannot be purchased with money, that their spiritual nature excludes them from material business transactions. The wise teacher, however, would also tell him that these spiritual necessities must be purchased, that though money cannot buy them, yet they have their price, that something must be parted with before they can be received, that, in a word, instead of offering money, he must offer up self or selfishness. For so much selfishness given up, so much religion, righteousness, and wisdom would be immediately received, and this without fail, and with perfect equity. For if a man is sure of receiving perishable material food and clothing for the money he puts down, how much more surely will he receive the imperishable spiritual sustenance and protection for the selfishness which he lays down? Shall the law operate in the lesser and fail in the greater? Man may fail to observe the law, but the law is infallible. A man may love his money, but he must part with it before he can receive the material comforts of life. Likewise, a man may love his selfish gratifications, but he must give them up before he can receive the spiritual comforts of religion. Now, when a tradesman gives goods for money, it is not that he may keep the money, but that he may give it in exchange for other goods. The primary function of business is not to enable everybody to hoard up money, but to facilitate the interchange of commodities. The miser is the greatest of all failures, and he may die of starvation and exposure while being a millionaire, because he is a worshipper of the letter of money, and an ignorer of its spirit, the spirit of mutual interchange. Money is a means, not an end. Its exchange is a sign that goods are being justly given and received. Thus commerce, with all its innumerable ramifications of detail, is reducible to one primary principle, namely, mutual interchange of the material necessities of life. Now let us follow this principle into the spiritual sphere and trace there its operation. When a religious man gives spiritual things, kindness, sympathy, love, and receives happiness in return, it is not that he may hoard and hug to himself that happiness, but that he may give it to others and so receive back spiritual things. The primary function of religion is not to enable all to hoard up personal pleasure, but to render actual the interchange of spiritual blessings. The most selfish man, he whose chief object is the getting of happiness for himself, is a spiritual miser, and his mind may perish of spiritual destitution, though he be surrounded with the objects which he has obtained to pander to his pleasure, because he is worshipping the letter of happiness and is ignoring its spirit, the spirit of unselfish interchange. The object of selfishness is the getting of personal pleasure or happiness. The object of religion is the diffusion of virtue. Thus religion, with all its innumerable creeds, may be resolved into one primary principle, namely, mutual interchange of spiritual blessings. What, then, are the spiritual blessings? They are kindness, brotherliness, goodwill, sympathy, forbearance, patience, trustfulness, peacefulness, love unending, and compassion unlimited. These blessings, these necessities for the starving spirit of man, can be obtained, but their price must be paid. Unkindness, uncharitableness, ill will, hardness, ill temper, impatience, suspicion, strife, hatred, and cruelty. All these, along with the happiness, the personal satisfaction which they give, must be yielded up. These spiritual coins, dead in themselves, must be parted with, and when parted with, there will be immediately received their spiritual counterparts, the living and imperishable blessings to which they are a means and of which they are a sign. To conclude, when a man gives money to a merchant and receives goods in return, he does not wish to have his money again. He has willingly parted with it forever and is satisfied with the exchange. So when a man gives up unrighteousness in exchange for righteousness, he does not wish to have his selfish pleasures back again. He has given them up forever and is satisfied and in peace. Thus also, when one bestows a gift, even though it be a material gift, he does not look for the receiver to send him back its value in money, because it is a religious deed and not a business transaction. The material thing thus given represents the interchange of a spiritual blessing and its accompanying bliss, the bliss of a gift bestowed and that of a gift received. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? Everything in the universe, every object and every thought is valued. Material things have a material value, spiritual things have a spiritual value, and to confound these values is not wise. To seek to purchase spiritual blessings with money or material luxuries with virtue is the way of selfishness and folly. It is to confound barter with religion and to make a religion of barter. Sympathy, kindness, and love cannot be bought and sold. They can only be given and received. When a gift is paid for, it ceases to be a gift. Because everything has a value, that which is freely given is gained with accumulation. He who gives up the lesser happiness of selfishness gains the greater happiness of unselfishness. The universe is just, and its justice is so perfect that he who once has perceived it can no more doubt or be afraid. He can only wonder and be glad. Light on the sense of proportion. In a nightmare, there is no relation of one thing to another. All things are haphazard, and there is general confusion and misery. Wise men have likened the self-seeking life to a nightmare, and there is a close resemblance between a selfish life, in which the sense of proportion is so far lost that things are only seen as they affect one's own selfish aims, and in which there are feverish excitements and overwhelming troubles and disasters, and that state of troubled sleep known as nightmare. In a nightmare, too, the controlling will and perceiving intelligence are asleep, and in a selfish life the better nature and spiritual perceptions are locked in profound slumber. The uncultivated mind lacks the sense of proportion. It does not see the right relation of one natural object to another, and is therefore dead to the beauty and harmony with which it is surrounded. And what is this sense of proportion but the faculty of seeing things as they are? It is a faculty which needs cultivating, and its cultivation, when applied to natural objects, embraces the entire intelligence and refines the moral nature. It enters, however, into spiritual things as well as things natural, and here is more lacking and more greatly needed. For to see things as they are in the spiritual sphere is to find no ground for grief, no lodging place for lamentation. Whence spring all this grief and anxiety and fear and trouble? Is it not because things are not as men wish them to be? Is it not because the multiplicity of desires prevents them from seeing things in their true perspective and right proportion? When one is overwhelmed with grief, he sees nothing but his loss. Its nearness to him blots out the whole view of life. The thing in itself may be small, but to the sufferer it assumes a magnitude which is out of all proportion to the surrounding objects of life. All who have passed the age of 30 can look back over their lives at times when they were perplexed with anxiety, overwhelmed with grief, or even perhaps on the verge of despair over incidents which, seen now in their right proportion, are known to be very small. If the would-be suicide will today stay his hand and wait, he will at the end of 10 years marvel at his folly over so comparatively small a matter. When the mind is possessed by passion or paralyzed with grief, it has lost the power of judgment. It cannot weigh and consider. It does not perceive the relative values and proportions of the things by which it is disturbed. Awake and acting, it yet moves in a nightmare which holds its faculties in thrall. The passionate partisan lacks this sense of proportion to such an extent that to him his own side or view appears all that is right and good, and his opponents all that is bad and wrong. To this partiality his reason is chained, so that whatever reason he may bring to bear upon the matter is enlisted in the service of bias and is not exercised in order to find the just relation which exists between the two sides. He is so convinced that his own party is all right and the other equally intelligent party is all wrong that it is impossible for him to be impartial and just. The only thing he understands as justice is that of getting his own way or placing some ruling power in the hands of his party. Just as the sense of proportion in things material puts an end to the spirit of repugnance, so in things spiritual it puts an end to the spirit of strife. The true artist does not see ugliness anywhere, he sees only beauty. That which is loathsome to others fills to him its rightful place in nature, and it appears in his picture as a thing of beauty. The true seer does not see evil anywhere, he sees universal good. That which is hateful to others, he sees in its rightful place in the scheme of evolution, and it is held dispassionately in his mind as an object of contemplation. Men worry and grieve and fight because they lack this sense of proportion, because they do not see things in their right relations. The objects of their turbulence are not things in themselves, but their own opinions about things, self-created shadows, the unreal creations of an egoistic nightmare. The cultivation and development of the ethical sense of proportion converts the heated partisan into the gentle peacemaker, and gives the calm and searching eye of the prophet to the hitherto blind instrument in the clashing play of selfish forces. The spiritual sense of proportion gives sanity. It restores the mind to calmness. It bestows impartiality and justice, and reveals a universe of faultless harmony. Light on adherence to principle. The man of truth never departs from the divine principles which he has espoused. He may be threatened with sickness, poverty, pain, loss of friends and position, yea, even with immediate death. Yet he does not desert the principles which he knows to be eternally true. To him there is one thing more grievous, more to be feared and shunned than all the above evils put together, and that is the desertion of principle. To turn coward in the hour of trial, to deny conscience, to join the rabble of passions, desires, and fears in turning upon, accusing, and crucifying the eternal Christ of divine principle, because, forsooth, that principle has not given him personal health, affluence, and ease. This, to the man of truth, is the evil of evils, the sin of sins. We cannot escape sickness and death. Though we avoid them for a long time, in the end they will overtake us. But we can escape wrongdoing, we can avoid fear and cowardice, and when we eschew wrongdoing and cast out fear, the evils of life will not subdue us when they overtake us, for we shall have mastered them. Instead of avoiding them for a season, we shall have conquered them on their own ground. There are those who teach that it is right to do wrong when that wrong is to protect another, that it is good, for instance, to tell a lie when its object is the well-being of another. That is, that it is right to desert the principle of truthfulness under severe trial. Such teaching has never emanated from the lips of the great teachers. It has not been uttered even by those lesser yet superbly noble men, the prophets, saints, and martyrs, for these divinely illuminated men knew full well that no circumstance can make a wrong a right, and that a lie has no saving and protective power. Wrongdoing is a greater evil than pain, and a lie is more deadly and destructive than death. Jesus rebuked Peter for trying to shield his master's life by wrongdoing, and no right-minded person would accept life at the expense of the moral character of another, when it appeared possible to do so. All men admire and revere the martyrs, those steadfast men and women who feared wrong, cowardice, and lying, but who did not fear pain and death, who were steadfast and calm in their adherence to principle, even when brought to the utmost extremity of trial, yea, even when the taunts and jeers of enemies assailed them, and the tears and agonies of loved ones appealed to them. They flinched not, nor turned back, knowing that the future good and salvation of the whole world depended upon their firmness in that supreme hour. And for this, they stand through all time as monuments of virtue, centers of saving and uplifting power for all humankind. But he who lied to save himself, or for the sake of the 2 or 3 beings whom he personally loved, is rarely heard of, for in that hour of desertion of principle, his power was gone. And if he is heard of, he is not loved for that lie. He is always looked upon as one who fell when the test was applied. As an example of the highest virtue, he is rejected by all men in all times. Had all men believed that an untruth was right under extreme circumstances, we should have had no martyrs and saints. The moral fiber of humanity would have been undermined, and the world left to grope in ever-deepening darkness. The attitude which regards wrongdoing for the sake of others as the right thing to do is based on the tacit assumption that wrong and untruth are inferior evils to unhappiness, pain, and death. But the man of moral insight knows that wrong and untruth are the greater evils, and so he never commits them, even though his life or the lives of others appear to be at stake. It is easy for a man in the flowery time of ease or the heyday of prosperity to persuade himself that he is staunchly adhering to principle, but when pain overtakes him, when the darkness of misfortune begins to settle down upon him and the pressure of circumstances hems him in, then he is on his trial, then he has come to his testing time. In that season it will be brought to the light whether he clings to self or adheres to truth. Principles are for our salvation in the hour of need. If we desert them in that hour, how can we be saved from the snares and pains of self? If a man does wrong to his conscience, thinking thereby to avoid some immediate pain or pressing evil, he does but increase pain and evil. The good man is less anxious to avoid pain than wrongdoing. There is neither wisdom nor safety in deserting permanent and protective principles when our happiness seems to be at stake. If we desert the true for the pleasant, we shall lose both the pleasant and the true. But if we desert the pleasant for the true, the peace of truth will soothe away our sorrow. If we barter the higher for the lower, emptiness and anguish will overtake us, and then, having abandoned the eternal, where is our rock of refuge? But if we yield up the lower for the higher, the strength and satisfaction of the higher will remain with us, fullness of joy will overtake us, and we shall find in truth a rock of refuge from the evils and sorrows of life. To find the permanent amid all the changes of life, and having found it, adhere to it under all circumstances. This only is true happiness. This only is salvation and lasting peace. Light on the sacrifice of the self. Self-sacrifice is one of the fundamental principles in the teaching of all the great spiritual masters. It consists in yielding up self or selfishness so that truth may become the source of conduct. Self is not an entity that has to be cast out, but a condition of mind that has to be converted. The renunciation of self is not the annihilation of intelligent being, but the annihilation of every dark and selfish desire. Self is the blind clinging to perishable things and transient pleasures as distinguished from the intelligent practice of virtue and righteousness. Self is the lusting, coveting, desiring of the heart, and it is this that must be yielded up before truth can be known, with its abiding calm and endless peace. To give up things will not avail. It is the lust for things that must be sacrificed. Though a man sacrifice wealth, position, friends, fame, home, wife, child, yea, and life also, it will not avail if self is not renounced. Buddha renounced the world and all that it held dear to him, but for 6 years he wandered and searched and suffered, and not till he yielded up the desires of his heart did he become enlightened and arrive at peace. By giving up only the objects of self-indulgence, no peace will ensue, but torment will follow. It is self-indulgence, the desire for the object, that must be abandoned. Then peace enters the heart. Sacrifice is painful so long as there is any vestige of self remaining in the heart. While there remains in the heart a lurking desire for an unworthy object or pleasure that has been sacrificed, there will be periods of intense suffering and fierce temptation. But when the desire for the unworthy object or pleasure is put away forever from the mind, and the sacrifice is complete and perfect, then, concerning that particular object or pleasure, there can be no more suffering or temptation. So when self in its entirety is sacrificed, sacrifice in its painful aspect is at an end, and perfect knowledge and perfect peace are reached. Hatred is self, covetousness is self, envy and jealousy are self, malice is self, pride and superciliousness are self, vanity and boasting are self, gluttony and sensuality are self, lying and deception are self, speaking evil of one's neighbor is self, anger and revenge are self. Self-sacrifice consists in yielding up all these dark conditions of mind and heart. The process is a painful one in its early stages, but soon a divine peace descends at intervals upon the pilgrim. Later, this peace remains longer with him, and finally, when the rays of truth begin to be shed abroad in the heart, remains with him. This sacrifice leads to peace, for in the perfect life of truth, there is no more sacrifice and no more pain and sorrow. For where there is no more self, there is nothing to be given up. Where there is no clinging of the mind to perishable things, there is nothing to be renounced. Where all has been laid upon the altar of truth, selfish love is swallowed up in divine love, and in divine love there is no thought of self, for there is the perfection of insight, enlightenment, and immortality, and therefore perfect peace. Light on the management of the mind. Following the last chapter, a few hints on the management of one's mind will doubtless be opportune. Before a man can see even the necessity for thorough and complete self-government, he will have to throw off a great delusion in which so many are involved, the delusion of believing that his lapses of conduct are due to those about him and not entirely to himself. I could make far greater progress if I were not hindered by others, or it is impossible for me to make any headway, seeing that I live with such irritable people, are commonly expressed complaints which spring from the error of imagining that others are responsible for one's own folly. The violent or irritable man always blames those about him for his fits of anger, and by continually living in this delusion, he becomes more and more confirmed in his rashness and perturbations. For how can a man overcome, nay, how can he even try to overcome, his weakness, if he convinces himself that it springs entirely from the actions of others? Moreover, firmly believing this as he does, he vents his anger more and more upon others in order to try and make matters better for himself, and so becomes completely lost to all knowledge of the real origin of his unhappy state. Men cast the blame of their unprosperous acts upon the abettors of their own resolve, or anything but their weak, guilty selves. All a man's weaknesses and sins and falls take their rise in his own heart, and he alone is responsible for them. It is true there are tempters and provokers, but temptations and provocations are powerless to him who refuses to respond to them. Tempters and provokers are but foolish men, and he who gives way to them has become a willing cooperator in their folly. He is unwise and weak, and the source of his troubles is in himself. The pure man cannot be tempted, the wise man cannot be provoked. Let a man fully realize that he is absolutely responsible for his every action, and he has already gone a considerable distance along the path which leads to wisdom and peace, for he will then commence to utilize temptation as a means of growth, and the wrong conduct of others he will regard as a test of his own strength. Socrates thanked the gods for the gift of a shrewish wife, in that it enabled him the better to cultivate the virtue of patience, and it is a simple and easily perceived truth that we can the better grow patient by living with the impatient, better grow unselfish by living with the selfish. If a man is impatient with the impatient, he is himself impatient. If he is selfish with the selfish, then he is himself selfish. The test and measure of virtue is trial and, like gold and precious stones, the more it is tested, the brighter it shines. If a man thinks he has a virtue, yet gives way when its opposing vice is presented to him, let him not delude himself. He has not yet attained to the possession of that virtue. If a man would rise and become a man indeed, let him cease to think the weak and foolish thought, I am hindered by others, and let him set about to discover that he is hindered only by himself. Let him realize that the giving way to another is but a revelation of his own imperfection, and lo, upon him will descend the light of wisdom, and the door of peace will open unto him, and he will soon become the conqueror of self. The fact that a man is continually troubled and disturbed by close contact with others is an indication that he requires such contact to impel him onward to a clearer comprehension of himself and toward a higher and more steadfast state of mind. The very things which he regards as insurmountable hindrances will become to him the most valuable aids when he fully realizes his moral responsibility and his innate power to do right. He will then cease to blame others for his unmanly conduct, and will commence to live steadfastly under all circumstances. The scales of self-delusion will quickly fall from his eyes, and he will then see that oft-times when he imagined himself provoked by others, he himself was really the provoker. And as he rises above his own mental perturbations, the necessity for coming in contact with the same conditions in others will cease, and he will pass by a natural process into the company of the good and pure, and will then awaken in others the nobility which he has arrived at in himself. Be noble, and the nobleness that lies in other men, sleeping but never dead, will rise in majesty to meet thine own. Light on self-control, the door of heaven. The foremost lesson which the world has to learn on its way to wisdom is the lesson of self-control. All the bitter punishments which men undergo in the school of experience are inflicted because they have failed to learn this lesson. Apart from self-control, salvation is a meaningless word, and peace is an impossibility. For how can a man be saved from any sin whilst he continues to give way to it? Or how can he realize abiding peace until he has conquered and subdued the troubles and perturbations of his mind? Self-control is the door of heaven. It leads to light and peace. Without it, a man is already in hell. He is lost in darkness and unrest. Men inflict upon themselves far-reaching sufferings and pass through indescribable torments both of body and soul through lack of self-control. And not until they resort to its practice can their sufferings and torments pass away, for it has no substitute, nothing can take its place, and there is no power in the universe that can do for a man that which he sooner or later must do for himself, by entering upon the practice of self-control. By self-control, a man manifests his divine power and ascends toward divine wisdom and perfection. Every man can practice it. The weakest man can begin now, and until he does begin, his weakness will remain, or he will become weaker still. Calling or not calling upon God or Jesus, Brahma or Buddha, spirits or masters, will not avail men who refuse to govern themselves and to purify their hearts. Believing or disbelieving that Jesus is God, that Buddha is omniscient, or the spirits or masters guide human affairs, cannot help men who continue to cling to the elements of strife and ignorance and corruption within themselves. What theological affirmation or denial can justify, or what outward power put right, the man who refuses to abandon a slanderous or abusive tongue, or give up an angry temper, or to sacrifice his impure imaginings? The flower reaches the upper light by first contending with the under darkness, and man can only reach the light of truth by striving against the darkness within himself. The vast importance of self-control is not realized by men, its absolute necessity is not apprehended by them, and the spiritual freedom and glory to which it leads are hidden from their eyes. Because of this, men are enslaved, and misery and suffering ensue. Let a man contemplate the violence, impurity, disease, and suffering which obtain upon earth, and consider how much of it is due to want of self-control, and he will gradually come to realize the great need there is for self-control. I say again that self-control is the gate. Refuse to practice self-control, then they fall into the great and dark delusion of separating religion from conduct. Then they persuade themselves that religion consists not in overcoming self and living blamelessly, but in holding a certain belief about Scripture and in worshiping a certain Savior in a particular way. Hence arise the innumerable complications and confusions of letter worship and the violence and bitter strife into which men fall in defense of their own formulated religion. But true religion cannot be formulated. It is purity of mind, a loving heart, a soul at peace with the world. It needs not to be defended, for it is being and doing and living. A man begins to practice religion when he begins to control himself. Light on acts and their consequences. One of the commonest excuses for wrongdoing is that if right were done, calamity would ensue. Thus the foolish concern themselves not with the act, but with the consequence of the act, a foreknowledge of which is assumed. The desire to secure pleasant results and to escape unpleasant consequences is at the root of that confusion of mind which renders men incapable of distinguishing between good and evil, and prevents them from practicing the one and abandoning the other. Even when it is claimed that the wrong thing is done not for oneself but in order to secure the happiness of others, the delusion is the same, only it is more subtle and dangerous. The wise concern themselves with the act and not with its consequences. They consider not what is pleasant or unpleasant, but what is right. Thus, doing what is right only and not straining after results, they are relieved of all burdens of doubt, desire, and fear. Nor can one who so acts ever become involved in an inextricable difficulty or be troubled with painful perplexity. His course is so simple, straight, and plain that he can never be confused with misgivings and uncertainties. Those who so act are said by Krishna to act without regard to the fruits of action, and he further declares that those who have thus renounced results are supremely good, supremely wise. Those who work for pleasant results only, and who depart from the right path when their or others' happiness appears to be at stake, cannot escape doubt, difficulty, perplexity, and pain. Ever forecasting probable consequences, they act in one way today and in another way tomorrow. Unstable and blown about by the changing winds of circumstance, they become more and more bewildered, and the consequences about which they trouble do not accrue. But they who work for righteousness only, who are careful to do the right act, putting away all selfish considerations, all thought of results, they are steadfast, unchanging, untroubled, and at peace amid all vicissitudes, and the fruits of their acts are ever sweet and blessed. Even the knowledge which only the righteous possess, that wrong acts can never produce good results, and that right acts can never bring about bad results, is in itself fraught with sweet assurance and peace. For whether the fruits of acts are sought or unsought, they cannot be escaped. They who sow to self and ignorant of the law of truth think they can make their own results, reap the bitter fruits of self. They who sow to righteousness, knowing themselves to be the reapers and not the makers of consequences, reap the sweet fruits of righteousness. Right is supremely simple and is without complexity. Error is interminably complex and involves the mind in confusion. To put away self and passion and establish oneself in right doing, this is the highest wisdom. Light on the way of wisdom. The path of wisdom is the highest way, the way in which all doubt and uncertainty are dispelled and knowledge and surety are realized. Amid the excitements and pleasures of the world and the surging whirlpools of human passions, wisdom, so calm, so silent, and so beautiful, is indeed difficult to find, difficult not because of its incomprehensible complexity, but because of its unobtrusive simplicity, and because self is so blind and rash, and so jealous of its rights and pleasures. Wisdom is rejected of men because it always comes right home to oneself in the form of wounding reproof, and the lower nature of man cannot bear to be reproved. Before wisdom can be acquired, self must be wounded to the death, and because of this, because wisdom is the enemy of self, self rises in rebellion and will not be overcome and denied. The foolish man is governed by his passions and personal cravings, and when about to do anything, he does not ask, "Is this right?" but only considers how much pleasure or personal advantage he will gain by it. He does not govern his passions and acts from fixed principles, but is the slave of his inclinations and follows where they lead. The wise man governs his passions and puts away all his personal cravings. He never acts from impulse and passion, but dispassionately considers what is right to be done and does it. He is always thoughtful and self-possessed, and guides his conduct by the loftiest moral principles. He is superior to both pleasure and pain. Wisdom cannot be found in books or travel, in learning or philosophy. It is acquired by practice only. A man may read the precepts of the greatest sages continually, but if he does not purify and govern himself, he will remain foolish. A man may be intimately conversant with the writings of the greatest philosophers, but so long as he continues to give way to his passions, he will not attain to wisdom. Wisdom is right action, right doing. Folly is wrong action, wrong doing. All reading, all study, all learning is vain if a man will not see his errors and give them up. Wisdom says to the vain man, "Do not praise yourself." To the proud man, "Humble yourself." To the gossip, "Govern your tongue." To the angry man, "Subdue your anger." To the resentful man, "Forgive your enemy." To the self-indulgent man, "Be temperate." To the impure man, "Purge your heart of lust." And to all men, "Beware of small faults. Do your own duty faithfully, and never intermeddle with the duty of another." These things are very simple. The doing of them is simple. But as it leads to the annihilation of self, the selfish tendencies in man object to them and rise up in revolt against them, loving their own life of turbulent excitement and feverish pleasure, and hating the calm and beautiful silence of wisdom. Thus men remain in folly. Nevertheless, the way of wisdom is always open, is always ready to receive the tread of the pilgrim who has grown weary of the thorny and intricate ways of folly. No man is prevented from becoming wise but by himself. No man can acquire wisdom but by his own exertions. And he who is prepared to be honest with himself, to measure the depths of his ignorance, to come face to face with his errors, to recognize and acknowledge his faults, and at once to set about the task of his own regeneration, such a man will find the way of wisdom, walking which, with humble and obedient feet, he will in due time come to the sweet city of deliverance. Light on disposition. I cannot help it. It is my disposition. How often one hears this expression as an excuse for wrongdoing. What does it imply? This, that the person who utters it believes that he has no choice in the matter, that he cannot alter his character. He believes that he must go on doing the wrong thing to the end of his days because he was born so, or because his father or grandfather was like it. Or if not these, then someone along the family line 100 or 200 or 300 years ago must have been afflicted, and therefore he is and must remain so. Such a belief should be uprooted, destroyed, and cast away, for it is not only without reason, it is a complete barrier to all progress, to all growth in goodness, to all development of character and noble expansion of life. Character is not permanent. It is indeed one of the most changeable things in nature. If not changed by a conscious act of the will, it is being continually modified and reformed by the pressure of circumstances. Disposition is not fixed, except insofar as one fixes it by continuing to do the same thing and by persistence in the stubborn belief that he cannot help it. Immediately when one gets rid of that belief, he will find that he can help it. Further, he will find that intelligence and will are instruments which he can mold disposition to any extent, and that too with considerable rapidity if one is in earnest. What is disposition but a habit formed by repeating the same thing over and over again? Cease repeating, doing the thing, and lo, the disposition is changed, the character is altered. To cease from an old habit of thought or action is, I know, difficult at first, but with each added effort the difficulty decreases and finally disappears, and then the new and good habit is formed, and the disposition is changed from bad to good. The character is ennobled, the mind is delivered from torment, and is lifted into joy. There is no need for anyone to remain the slave of a disposition which causes him unhappiness, and which he himself regards as undesirable. He can abandon it. He can break away from the slavery. He can deliver himself and be free. Light on individual liberty. Within the sphere of his own mind, man has all power. But in the sphere of other minds and outside things, his power is extremely limited. He can command his own mind, but he cannot command the mind of others. He can choose what he shall think, but he cannot choose what others shall think. He cannot control the weather as he wills, but he can control his mind and decide what his mental attitude toward the weather shall be. A man can reform the dominion of his own mind, but he cannot reform the outer world because that outer world is composed of other minds having the same freedom of choice as himself. A pure being cannot cleanse the heart of one less pure, but by his life of purity and by his elucidating his experience in the attainment of purity, he can, as a teacher, act as a guide to others and so enable them more readily and rapidly to purify themselves. But even then, those others have all power to decide whether they shall accept or reject such guidance, so complete is man's choice. It is because of this dual truth that man has no power in the outer realm of others' minds, and yet has all power over his own mind, that he cannot avoid the consequences of his own thoughts and acts. Man is altogether powerless to alter or avert consequences, but he is altogether powerful in his choice of causative thought. Having chosen his thoughts, he must accept their full consequences. Having acted, he cannot escape the full results of his act. Law reigns universally, and there is perfect individual liberty. A man can do as he likes, but all other men can do as they like. A man has power to steal, but others have power to protect themselves against the thief. Having sent out his thought, having acted his purpose, a man's power over that thought and purpose is at an end. The consequences are certain and cannot be escaped, and they will be of the nature of the thought and act which produce them, painful or blessed. Seeing that a man can think and do as he chooses, and that all others have the like liberty, a man has to learn sooner or later to reckon with other minds, and until he does this he will be ceaselessly involved in suffering. To think and act apart from the consideration of others is both an abuse of power and an infringement of liberty. Such thoughts and acts are annulled and brought to naught by the harmonizing principle of liberty itself, and such annulling and bringing to naught is felt by the individual as suffering. When the mind, rising above ignorance, recognizes the magnitude of its power within its own sphere, and, ceasing to antagonize itself against others, it harmonizes itself to those other minds, acknowledging their freedom of choice, then is realized spiritual plenitude and the cessation of suffering. Selfishness, egotism, and despotism are, from the spiritual standpoint, transferable terms. They are one and the same thing. Every selfish thought or act is a manifestation of egotism, is an effort of despotism, and is met with suffering and defeat. It is annulled because the law of liberty cannot, in the smallest particular, be annulled. If selfishness could conquer, liberty would be non-existent, but selfishness fails of all results but pain, because liberty is supreme. An act of selfishness contains two elements of egotism, namely, 1, the denial of the liberty of others, and 2, the assertion of one's own liberty beyond its legitimate sphere. It thereby destroys itself. Despotism is death. Man is not the creature of selfishness, he is the maker of it. It is an indication of his power to disobey even the law of his being. Selfishness is power without wisdom. It is energy wrongly directed. A man is selfish because he is ignorant of his nature and power as a mental being. Such ignorance and selfishness entails suffering, and by repeated suffering and age-long experience, he at last arrives at knowledge and the legitimate exercise of his power. The truly enlightened man cannot be selfish. He cannot accuse others of selfishness or try to coerce them into being unselfish. The selfish man is eager to bend others to his own way and will, believing it to be the only right way for all. He thereby ignorantly wastes himself in trying to check in others the power which he freely exercises himself, namely, the power to choose their own way and exercise their own will. By so doing, he places himself in direct antagonism with the like tendencies and freedom of other minds, and brings into operation the instruments of his own suffering. Hence the ceaseless interplay of conflicting forces, the unending conflagration of passion, the turmoil, strife, and woe. Selfishness is misapplied power. The unselfish man is he who, ceasing from all personal interference, abandoning the I as the source of judgment, and having recognized his illimitable freedom through the abandonment of all egotism even in thought, refrains from encroachment upon the boundless freedom of others, realizing the legitimacy of their choice and their right to the free employment of their power. However others may choose to act towards such a man, it can never cause him any trouble or suffering, because he is perfectly willing that they should so choose to act, and he harbors no wish that they should act in any other way. He realizes that his sole duty, as well as his entire power, lies in acting rightly toward them, and that he is in no way concerned with their actions toward him. That is both their choice and their business. To the unselfish man, therefore, malice, envy, backbiting, jealousy, accusation, condemnation, and persecution have passed away. Having ceased to practice these things, he is not disturbed when they are hurled at him. Thus, liberation from sin is liberation from suffering. The selfless man is free. He has made the thraldom of sin impossible. He has broken every bond. Light on the blessing and dignity of work. That labor is life is a principle pregnant with truth, and one which cannot be too often repeated or too closely studied and practiced. Labor is so often regarded as an irksome and even degrading means of obtaining ease and pleasure, and not as what it really is, a thing happy and noble in itself, that the lesson contained in the maxim needs to be taken to heart and more thoroughly learned. Activity, both mental and physical, is the essence of life. The complete cessation of activity is death, and death is immediately followed by corruption. Ease and death are closely associated. The more there is of activity, the more abounding is life. The brain worker, the original thinker, the man of unceasing mental activity, is the longest-lived man in the community. The agricultural laborer, the gardener, the man of unceasing physical activity comes next with length of years. Pure-hearted, healthy-minded people love work and are happy in their labors. They never complain of being overworked. It is very difficult, almost impossible for a man to be overworked if he lives a sound and pure life. It is worry, bad habits, discontent, and idleness that kill. Especially idleness, for if labor is life, then idleness must be death. Let us get rid of sin before we talk about being overworked. There are those who are afraid of work, regarding it as an enemy, and who fear a breakdown by doing too much. They have to learn what a health-bestowing friend work is. Others are ashamed of work, looking upon it as a degrading thing to be avoided. The pure in heart and sound in head are neither afraid nor ashamed of work, and they dignify whatsoever they undertake. No necessary work can be degrading, but if a man regard his work as such, he is already degraded, not by his task, but by his slavish vanity. Man hath his daily work of body and mind appointed, which declares his dignity. The idle man who is afraid of work, and the vain man who is ashamed of it, are both on the way to poverty, if they are not already there. The industrious man who loves work, and the man of true dignity who glorifies work, are both on their way to affluence, if they are not already there. The lazy man is sowing the seeds of poverty and crime. The vain man is sowing the seeds of humiliation and shame. The industrious man is sowing the seeds of affluence and virtue. The dignified worker is sowing the seeds of victory and honor. Deeds are seeds, and the harvest will appear in due season. There is a common desire to acquire riches with as little effort as possible, which is a kind of theft. To try to obtain the fruits of labor without laboring is to take the fruits of another man's labor. To try to get money without giving its equivalent is to take that which belongs to another and not to oneself. What is theft but this frame of mind carried to its logical extreme? Let us rejoice in our work. Let us rejoice that we have the strength and capacity for work, and let us increase that strength and capacity by unremitting labor. Whatever our work may be, it is noble, and will be perceived by the world as noble if we perform it in a noble spirit. The virtuous do not despise any labor which falls to their lot, and he who works and faints not, who is faithful, patient, and uncomplaining, even in the time of poverty, he will surely at last eat the sweet fruits of his labor, yea, even while he labors and seems to fail, happiness will be his constant companion. For, blessed is the man that has found his work. Let him ask no other blessedness. Light on good manners and refinement. Move upward, working out the beast, and let the ape and tiger die. All culture is getting away from the beast. Evolution itself is a refining process, and the unwritten laws of society inhere in the evolutionary law. Education is intellectual culture. The scholar is engaged in purifying and perfecting his intellect. The religious devotee is engaged in purifying and perfecting his heart. When a man aspires to nobler heights of achievement and sets about the realization of his ideal, he commences to refine his nature, and the more pure a man makes himself within, the more refined, gracious, and gentle will be his outward demeanor. Good manners have an ethical basis and cannot be divorced from religion. To be ill-mannered is to be imperfect, for what are ill manners but the outward expression of inward defects? What a man does, that he is. If he acts rudely, he is a rude man. If he acts foolishly, he is a foolish man. If he acts gently, he is a gentle man. It is a mistake to suppose that a man can have a gentle and refined mind behind a rough and brutal exterior, though such a man may possess some strong animal virtues, as the outer is an expression of the inner. One of the steps in the noble eightfold path to perfection, as expounded by Buddha, is right conduct or good behavior. And it should be plain to all that the man who has not yet learned how to conduct himself toward others in a kindly, gracious, and unselfish spirit has not yet entered the pathway of a holy life. If a man refines his heart, he will refine his behavior. If he refines his behavior, it will help him to refine his heart. To be coarse, brutish, and snappish may be natural to a beast, but the man who aspires to be even an endurable member of society, not to mention the higher manhood, will at once purge away any such bestial traits that may possess him. All those things which aid in man's refinement, such as music, painting, poetry, manners, are servants and messengers of progress. Man degrades himself when he imitates the brute. Let us not mistake barbarism for simplicity, or vulgarity for honesty. Unselfishness, kindliness, and consideration for others will always be manifested outwardly as gentleness, graciousness, and refinement. To effect these graces by simulating them may seem to succeed, but it does not. Affectation and hypocrisy are soon divulged. Every man's eye, sooner or later, pierces through their flimsiness, and ultimately none but the actors of them are deceived. As Emerson says, "What is done for effect is seen to be done for effect, and what is done for love is felt to be done for love." Children who are well-bred are taught always to consider the happiness of others before their own, to offer them the most comfortable seat, the choicest fruit, the best tidbit, and so on, and also to do everything, even the most trivial acts, in the right way. And these two things, unselfishness and right action, are at the basis not only of good manners, but of all ethics, religion, and true living. They represent power and skill. The selfish man is weak and unskillful in the exercise of thought. The vulgar man is weak and unskillful in his actions. Unselfishness is the right way of thinking. Good manners are the right way of acting. As Emerson again says, "There is always a best way of doing everything, if it be to boil an egg. Manners are the happy way of doing things right." It is a frequent error among men to imagine that the higher life is an ideal, something quite above and apart from the common details of life, and that to neglect these or to perform them in a slovenly manner is an indication that the mind is occupied on higher things, whereas it is an indication that the mind is becoming inexact, dreamy, and weak, instead of exact, wide awake, and strong. No matter how apparently trivial the thing is which has to be done, there is a right way and a wrong way of doing it, and to do it in the right way saves friction, time, and trouble, conserves power, and develops grace, skill, and happiness. The artisan has a variety of tools with which to ply his particular craft, and he is taught, and also finds by experience, that each tool must be applied to its special use, and never under any circumstances must one tool be made to do service for another. By using every tool in its proper place and in the right way, the maximum of dexterity and power is attained. Should a boy in learning a trade refuse instruction and persist in using the tools in his own way, making one tool do service for another, he would never become anything better than a clumsy bungler and would be a failure in his trade. It is the same throughout the whole life. If a man opens himself to receive instruction and studies how to do everything rightfully and lawfully, he becomes strong and skillful and wise, master of himself, his thoughts, and actions. But if he persists in following his momentary impulses, in doing everything as he feels prompted, not exercising thoughtfulness and rejecting instruction, such a man will attain to nothing better than a slovenly and bungling life. Confucius paid the strictest attention to dress, eating, deportment, passing speech, to all the so-called trivialities of life, as well as to the momentous affairs of state and the lofty moral principles which he expounded. And he taught his disciples that it is the sign of a vulgar and foolish mind to regard anything as trivial that is necessary to be done, that the wise man pays attention to all his duties and does everything wisely, thoughtfully, and rightly. It is not an arbitrary edict of society that the man who persists in eating with his knife shall be rejected, for a knife is given to cut with and a fork to eat with, and to put things to wrong and slovenly uses, even in the passing details of life, does not make for progress, but is retrogressive and makes for confusion. It is not a despotic condition in the law of things that so long as a man persists in thinking and acting unkindly of and toward others, he shall be shut out from heaven, and shall remain in the outer pain and unrest. For selfishness is disruption and disorder. The universe is sustained by exactness. It rests on order. It demands right doing, and the searcher for wisdom will watch all his ways. He will think purely, speak gently, and act graciously, refining his entire nature, both in the letter and the spirit. Light on Diversities of Creeds. Those who depart from the common track in matters of faith and strike out independently in search of the higher life as distinguished from the letter of religious dogma are apt to sink into a pitfall which awaits them at the first step, namely, the pitfall of pride. Attacking creeds and speaking contemptuously of the orthodox, as though orthodoxy were synonymous with evil, are not uncommon practices among those who fondly imagine they are in possession of greater spiritual light. Departure from orthodoxy does not by any means include departure from sin. Indeed, it is not infrequently accompanied with increased bitterness and contempt. Change of opinion is one thing, change of heart is quite another. To withdraw one's adherence from creeds is easy. To withdraw oneself from sin is more difficult. Hatred and pride, and not necessarily orthodoxy and conformity, are the things to be avoided. One's own sin, and not another man's creed, is the thing to be despised. The right-minded man cannot plume himself on being broader than others, or assume that he is on a higher plane than others, or think with pharisaical contempt of those who still cling to some form of letter worship which he has abandoned. Applying the words narrow, bigoted, and selfish to others is not the indication of an enlightened mind. No person would wish these terms to be applied to himself, and he who is becoming truly religious does not speak of others in words which would wound him were they directed toward himself. Those who are learning to exercise humility and compassion are becoming truly enlightened. Thinking lowly of themselves and kindly of others, condemning their own sins with merciless logic, and thinking with tender pity of the sins of others, they develop that insight into the nature and law of things which enables them to see the truth that is in others and in the religions of others, and they do not condemn their neighbor because he holds a different faith or because he adheres to a formal creed. Creeds must be, and he who performs faithfully his duty in his particular creed, not interfering with or condemning his neighbor in the performance of his duty, is bringing the world nearer to perfection and peace. Amid all the diversities of creeds, there is the unifying power of undying and unalterable love, and he who has love has entered into sympathetic union with all. He who has acquired the true spirit of religion, who has attained to pure insight and deep charity of heart, will avoid all strife and condemnation, and will not fall into the delusion of praising his own sect should he belong to one, and trying to prove that it alone is right, and of dispraising other sects, and trying to prove that they are false. As the true man does not speak in praise of himself or his own work, so the man of humility, charity, and wisdom does not speak of his own sect as being superior to all others, nor seek to elevate his own particular religion by picking holes in forms of faith which are held as sacred by others. Nothing more explicit and magnanimous has ever been uttered in reference to this particular phase of the practice of charity than is to be found in the 12th edict of Asoka, the great Indian ruler and saint who lived some 2 or 3 centuries previous to the Christian era, and whose life, devoted to the spread of truth, testified to the beauty of his words. The edict runs thus: there should be no praising of one's own sect and decrying of other sects, but, on the contrary, a rendering of honor to other sects, for whatever cause honor may be due. By so doing, both one's own sect may be helped forward, and other sects will be benefited. By acting otherwise, one's own sect will be destroyed in injuring others. Whosoever exalts his own sect by decrying others does so doubtless out of love for his own sect, thinking to spread abroad the fame thereof. But on the contrary, he inflicts the more an injury upon his own sect. These are wise and holy words, the breath of charity is in them, and they may be well pondered upon by those who are anxious to overthrow not the religions of other men, but their own shortcomings. It is a dark and deep-seated delusion that causes a man to think he can best advance the cause of his own religion by exposing what he regards as the evils of other religions. And the most pitiful part of it is that while such a one rejoices in the thought that by continually belittling other sects, he will perhaps at last wipe them out and win all men to his side, he is all the time engaged in the sad work of bringing into disrepute and thereby destroying his own sect. Just as every time a man slanders another, he inflicts lasting injury upon his own character and prospects, so every time one speaks evil of another sect, he soils and demeans his own. And the man who is prone to attack and condemn other religions is the one who suffers most when his own is attacked and condemned. If a man does not like that his own religion should be denounced as evil and false, he should carefully guard himself that he does not condemn other religions as such. If it pleases him when his own cause is well spoken of and helped, he should speak well of and help other causes which, while differing from his own in method, have the same good end in view. In this way he will escape the errors and miseries of sectarian strife and will perfect himself in divine charity. The heart that has embraced gentleness and charity avoids all those blind passions which keep the fires of party strife, violence, persecution, and bitterness burning from age to age. It dwells in thoughts of pity and tenderness, scorning nothing, despising nothing, not stirring up enmity, for he who acquires gentleness gains that clear insight into the great law which cannot be obtained in any other way. He sees that there is good in all sects and religions, and he makes that good his own. Let the truth-seeker avoid divisions and invidious distinctions, and let him strive after charity, for charity does not slander, backbite, or condemn. It does not think of trampling down another's and elevating its own. Truth cannot contradict itself. The nature of truth is exactness, reality, undeviating certitude. Why then the ceaseless conflict between the religions and creeds? Is it not because of error? Contradiction and conflict belong to the domain of error, for error, being confusion, is in the nature of self-contradiction. If the Christian says, "My religion is true and Buddhism is false," and if the Buddhist says, "Christianity is false and Buddhism is true," we are at once confronted with an irreconcilable contradiction. For these two religions cannot be both true and false. Such a contradiction cannot spring from truth and must therefore spring from error. But if both these religious partisans should now say or think, "Yes, truly the contradiction springs from error, but the error is in the other man and his religion, and not in me and mine," this does but intensify the contradiction. Whence then springs the error, and where is truth? Does not the very attitude of mind which these men adopt toward each other constitute the error? And were they to reverse that attitude, exchanging antagonism for goodwill, would they not perceive the truth which does not stand in conflict with itself? The man who says, "My religion is true and my neighbor's is false," has not yet discovered the truth in his own religion, for when a man has done that, he will see truth in all religions. As behind all the universal phenomena there is but one truth, so behind all the religions and creeds there is but one religion, for every religion contains the same ethical teaching, and all the great teachers taught exactly the same thing. The precepts of the Sermon on the Mount are to be found in all religions, and the life which those precepts demand was lived by all the great teachers and many of their disciples. For the truth is a pure heart and a blameless life, and not a set of dogmas and opinions. All religions teach purity of heart, holiness of life, compassion, love, and goodwill. They teach the doing of good deeds and the giving up of selfishness and sin. These things are not dogmas, theologies, and opinions. They are things to be done, to be practiced, to be lived. Men do not differ about these things, for they are the acknowledged verities in every sect. What then do they differ about? About their opinions, their speculations, their theologies. Men differ about that which is unreal, not that which is real. They fight over error and not over truth. The very essential of all religion and religions is that before a man can know anything of truth, he must cease from fighting his fellow man, and shall learn to regard him with goodwill and love. And how can a man do this while he is convinced that his neighbor's religion is false, and that it is his duty to do all that he can to undermine and overthrow it? This is not doing unto others as we would that they should do to us. That which is true and real is true and real everywhere and always. There is no distinction between the pious Christian and the pious Buddhist. Purity of heart, piety of life, holy aspirations, and the love of truth are the same in the Buddhist as the Christian. The good deeds of the Buddhist are not different from the good deeds of the Christian. Remorse for sin and sorrow for wrong thoughts and deeds spring in the hearts not only of Christians, but men of all religions. Great is the need of sympathy. Great is the need of love. All religions are the same in that they teach the same fundamental verities, but men, instead of practicing these verities, engage in opinions and speculations about things which are outside the range of knowledge and experience. And it is in defending and promulgating their own particular speculations that men become divided and engage in conflict with each other. Condemnation is incipient persecution. The thought, I am right and you are wrong, is a seed prolific of hatred. It was out of this seed that the Spanish Inquisition grew. He who would find the universal truth must abandon egotism, must quench the hateful flames of condemnation, and, taking out of his heart the baneful thought, all others are wrong, must think the illuminating thought, it is I who am wrong, and having thus thought, he will cease from sin and will live in love and goodwill toward all, making no distinctions, engaging in no divisions, a peacemaker, not a partisan. Thus living charitably disposed toward all, he will become one with all, and will comprehend the universal truth, the eternal religion. For while error refutes error, and selfishness divides, truth demonstrates truth, and religion unifies. Light on Law and Miracle. The love of the wonderful is an element in human nature which, like passions and desires, requires to be curbed, directed, and finally transmuted. Otherwise, superstition and the obscuration of reason and insight cannot be avoided. The idea of miracle must be transcended before the orderly, eternal, and beneficent nature of law can be perceived, and that peace and certainty which a knowledge of law bestows can be enjoyed. Just as a child, when its eyes are open to the phenomena of this world, becomes involved in wonder and revels in tales of giants and fairies, so when a man first opens his mental eyes to spiritual things, does he become involved in stories of marvels and miracles. And as the child at last becomes a man and leaves behind him the crudities of childhood, understanding more accurately the relative nature of the phenomena around him, so with a fuller spiritual development and greater familiarity with the inner realities, a man at last leaves behind him the era of childish wonderment, comes into touch with the laws of things, and governs his life by principles that are fixed and invariable. Law is universal and eternal, and although vast areas of knowledge are waiting to be revealed, cause and effect will ever prevail, and every new discovery, every truth revealed, will serve to bring men nearer to a realization of the beauty, stability, and supremacy of law. And very gladdening it is to know that law is inviolable and eternal throughout every department of nature, for then we know that the operations of the universe are ever the same, and can therefore be discovered, understood, and obeyed. This is a ground of certainty and therefore of great hope and joy. The idea of miracle is a denial of law and the substitution of an arbitrary and capricious power. It is true that around the lives of the great teachers of humanity, stories of miracle have grown, but they have emanated from the undeveloped minds of the people and not from the teachers themselves. Lao Tzu expanded the supreme law or reason which admits of no miracle. Yet his religion has today become so corrupted with the introduction of the marvelous as to be little better than a mass of superstition. Even Buddhism, whose founder declared that Seeing that the law of karma, cause and effect, governs all things, the disciple who aims at performing miracles does not understand the doctrine, and that the desire to perform miracles arises either from covetousness or vanity, has surrounded in its corrupted form the life of its great master with a number of miracles. Even during the lifetime of Ramakrishna, the Hindu teacher who died in 1886, and who is regarded by his disciples as an incarnation of deity to this age, all sorts of miracles were attributed to him by the people and are now associated with his name. Yet, according to Max Mueller, these miracles are without any foundation of evidence or fact, and Ramakrishna himself ridiculed and repudiated miracle. As men become more enlightened, miracles and wonder-working will be expunged from religion, and the orderly beauty of law and the ethical grandeur of obedience to law will become revealed and known. No man who desires to perform miracles or astral or psychological wonders, who is curious to see invisible or supernatural beings, or who is ambitious to become a master or an adept, can attain a clear perception of truth and the living of the highest life. Childish wonderment about things must be supplanted by knowledge of things, and vanity is a complete barrier to the entrance of the true path, which demands of the disciple lowliness of heart, humility. He is on the true path who is cultivating kindliness, forbearance, and a loving heart, and the marks of the true master are not miracles and wonder-working, but infinite patience, boundless compassion, spotless purity, and a heart at peace with all. Light on War and Peace. War springs from inward strife. War in heaven precedes war on earth. When the inward spiritual harmony is destroyed by division and conflict, it will manifest itself outwardly in the form of war. Without this inward conflict, war could not be, nor can war cease until the inward harmony is restored. War consists of aggression and resistance, and after the fight has commenced, both combatants are, alike, aggressors and resistors. Thus the effort to put an end to war by aggressive means produces war. "I have set myself stubbornly against the war spirit," said a man a short time ago. He did not know that he was, by that attitude of mind, practicing and fostering the war spirit. To fight against war is to produce war. It is impossible to fight for peace, because all fighting is the annihilation of peace. To think of putting an end to war by denouncing and fighting it is the same as if one should try to quench fire by throwing straw upon it. He, therefore, who is truly a man of peace does not resist war, but practices peace. He who takes sides and practices attack and defense is responsible for war, for he is always at war in his mind. He cannot know the nature of peace, for he has not arrived at peace in his own heart. The true man of peace is he who has put away from his mind the spirit of quarreling and party strife, who neither attacks others nor defends himself, and whose heart is at peace with all. Such a man has already laid in his heart the foundations of the empire of peace. He is a peacemaker, for he is at peace with the whole world and practices the spirit of peace under all circumstances. Very beautiful is the spirit of peace, and it says, "Come and rest." Bickerings, quarrelings, party divisions, these must be forever abandoned by him who would establish peace. War will continue so long as men will allow themselves individually to be dominated by passion, and only when men have quelled the inward tumult will the outward horror pass away. Self is the great enemy, the producer of all strife, and the maker of many sorrows. He, therefore, who will bring about peace on earth, let him overcome egotism, let him subdue his passions, let him conquer himself. Light on the brotherhood of man. There is no lack of writing and preaching about universal brotherhood, and it has been adopted as a leading article of faith by many newly formed societies. But what is so urgently needed to begin with is not universal brotherhood, but particular brotherhood, that is, the adoption of a magnanimous, charitable, and kindly spirit toward those with whom we come in immediate contact, toward those who contradict, oppose, and attack us, as well as toward those who love and agree with us. I make a very simple statement of truth when I say that until such particular brotherhood is practiced, universal brotherhood will remain a meaningless term, for universal brotherhood is an end, a goal, and the way to it is by particular brotherhood. The one is a sublime and far-reaching consummation, the other is the means by which that consummation must be realized. I remember on one occasion reading a paper devoted largely to the teaching of universal brotherhood, and the leading article, a long and learned one, was an exposition of this subject. But on turning over a few more pages, I found another piece by the same writer in which he accused of misrepresentation, lying, and selfishness not his enemies, but the brethren of his own society, who bear, at least as far as such sins are concerned, stainless reputations. A scriptural writer has asked the question, if a man love not his brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen? In the same manner, if a man does not love the brother whom he knows, how can he love men of all creeds and all nations whom he does not know? To write articles on universal brotherhood is one thing. To live in peace with one's relations and neighbors and to return good for evil is quite another. To endeavor to propagate universal brotherhood while fostering in our hearts some sparks of envy, spite, resentment, malice, or hatred is to be self-deluded. For thus shall we be all the time hindering and denying by our actions that which we eulogize by our words. But so subtle is such self-delusion that until the very heights of love and wisdom are reached, we are all liable at any moment to fall into it. It is not because our fellow men do not hold our views or follow our religion or see as we see that universal brotherhood remains unrealized, but because of the prevalence of ill will, and if we hate, avoid, and condemn others because they differ from us, or treat selfishly and harshly those who are near to us, all that we may say or do in the cause of universal brotherhood will be only another snare to our feet, a mockery to our aspirations, and a farce to the world at large. Let us then remove all hatred and malice from our hearts. Let us be filled with goodwill toward those who try and test us by their immediate nearness. Let us love them that hate us and think magnanimously of those who condemn us or our doctrine. In a word, let us take the first step toward universal brotherhood by practicing brotherhood in the place where we now are and toward those with whom we associate, which is the place where it is most needed. And as we succeed in being brotherly in these important particulars, universal brotherhood will be found to be not far distant. Light on life's sorrows. There is great sorrow in the world. This is one of the supreme facts of life. Grief and affliction visit every heart, and many that are today reveling in hilarious joy or sinful riot will tomorrow be smitten low with sorrow. Suddenly and with swift and silent certainty comes its poignant arrow, entering the human heart, slaying its joy, laying low its hopes, and shattering all its earthly plans and prospects. Then the humbled, smitten soul reflects and enters deeply and sympathetically into the hidden meanings of human life. In the dark times of sorrow, men approach very near to truth. When in one brief hour the builded hopes of many years of toil fall like a toy palace, and all earthly pleasures burst and vanish like petty bubbles in the grasp, then the crushed spirit, bewildered, tempest-tossed, and without a refuge, gropes in dumb anguish for the eternal and seeks its abiding peace. Blessed are they that mourn, said the teacher of the West, and the teacher of the East declared that, where there is great suffering, there is great bliss. Both these sayings express the truth that sorrow is a teacher and a purifier. Sorrow is not the end of life, though it is in its consummation the end of the worldly life. But it is the beginning of the heavenly life. It leads the bewildered spirit into rest and safety, for the end of sorrow is joy and peace. Strong searcher for truth, strenuous fighter against self and passion, seasons of sorrow must be your portion for a time. While any vestige of self remains, temptations will assail you, and the veil of illusion will cloud your spiritual vision, producing sorrow and unrest. And when heavy clouds settle down upon your spirit, accept the darkness as your own, and pass through it bravely into the cloudless light beyond. Bear well in mind that nothing can overtake you that does not belong to you, and that is not for your eternal good. As the poet has truly sung, "Nor space, nor time, nor deep, nor high can keep my own away from me." And not alone are the bright things of life yours, the dark things are yours also. When difficulties and troubles gather thickly about you, when failures come and friends fall away, when the tongue that sweetly praised you bitterly blames, when beloved lips that pressed upon your lips the soft warm kisses of love taunt and mock you in the lonely hour of your solitary grief, or when you lay beneath the sod, the cold casket of clay that but yesterday held the responsive spirit of your beloved, when these things overtake you, remember that the hour of your Gethsemane has come, that the cup of anguish is yours to drink. Drink it silently and murmur not, for in that hour of oppressive darkness and blinding pain, no prayer will save you, no cry to heaven will bring you sweet relief. But faith and patience only will give you the strength to endure, and to go through your crucifixion with a meek and gentle spirit, not complaining, blaming no one, but accepting it as your own. When one has reached the lowest point of sorrow, when weak and exhausted and overcome with a sense of powerlessness, he cries to God for help, and there comes no answering comfort and no succor. Then, discovering the painfulness of sorrow and the insufficiency of prayer alone, he is ready to enter the path of self-renunciation, ready to purify his heart, ready to practice self-control, ready to become a spiritual athlete, and to develop that divine and invincible strength which is born of self-mastery. He will find the cause of sorrow in his own heart and will remove it. He will learn to stand alone, not craving sympathy from any, but giving it to all. Not thoughtlessly sinning and remorsefully repenting, but studying how not to commit sin. Humbled by innumerable defeats and chastened by many sufferings, he will learn how to act blamelessly toward others, how to be gentle and strong, kind and steadfast, compassionate and wise. Thus he will gradually rise above sorrow, and at last truth will dawn upon his mind, and he will understand the meaning of abiding peace. His mental eye will open to perceive the cosmic order. He will be blessed with the vision of the law, and will receive the beatific bliss. When the true order of things is perceived, sorrow is transcended. When the contracted personal self, which hugs its own little fleeting pleasures and broods over its own petty disappointments and dissatisfactions, is broken up and cast away, then the larger life of truth enters the mind, bringing bliss and peace, and the universal will takes the place of self. The individual becomes one with humanity. He forgets self in his love for all. His sorrow is swallowed up in the bliss of truth. Thus, when you have, by experience, entered completely into the sorrow that is never lifted from the heart of mankind, when you have reaped and eaten all the bitter fruits of your own wrong thoughts and deeds, then divine compassion for all suffering beings will be born in your heart, healing all your wounds and drying all your tears. You will rise again into a new and heavenly life, where the sting of sorrow cannot enter, for there is no self there. After the crucifixion comes the transfiguration. The sorrowless state is reached through sorrow, and the wise do not grieve. Ever remember this: in the midst of sin and sorrow, there abides the world of truth. Redemption is at hand. The troubled may find peace, the impure may find purity. Healing awaits the broken-hearted. The weak will be adorned with strength, and the downtrodden will be lifted up and glorified. Light on life's changes. The tendency of things to advance from a lower to a higher level, and from high to higher still, is universal. The worlds exist in order that beings may experience, and by experiencing, acquire knowledge and increase in wisdom. Evolution is only another word for progress. It signifies perpetual change, but a purposeful change, a change accompanied by growth. Evolution does not mean the creation of a new being from a being of a different order. It means the modification of beings by experience and change, and such modification is progress. The fact of change is ever before us. Nothing can escape it. Plants, animals, and men germinate, reach maturity, and pass into decay. Even the lordly suns and their attendant worlds rolling through illimitable spaces, although their life is reckoned in millions of years, at last decay and perish after having passed through innumerable changes. We cannot say of any being or object, "This will remain forever as it is," for even while we are saying it, the being or object would be undergoing change. Sadness and suffering accompany this change, and beings mourn for that which has departed, for the things which are lost and gone. Yet in reality change is good, for it is the open door to all achievement, advancement, and perfection. Mind, as well as matter, is subject to the same change. Every experience, every thought, every deed changes a man. There is little resemblance between the old man and his period of childhood and youth. An externally fixed, unchangeable being is not known. Such a being may be assumed, but it is a postulate only. It is not within the range of human observation and knowledge. A being not subject to change would be a being outside progress. There is a teaching which declares that man has a spiritual soul that is eternally pure, eternally unchanged, eternally perfect, and that the sinning, suffering, changing man as we see him is an illusion. That indeed the spiritual soul is the man, and the other is an unreality. There is another teaching that affirms that man is eternally imperfect, that stainless purity can never be reached, and that perfection is an impossibility, an illusion. It will be found that these two extremes have no relation to human experience. They are both of the nature of speculative metaphysics, which stand in opposition to the facts of life, so much so that the adherents of these two extremes deny the existence of the commonest everyday facts of human experience. That which is assumed is regarded as real. The facts of life are declared to be unreal. It is well to avoid both these extremes and find the middle way of human experience. It is well to avoid opinions and speculations of our own or others. It is well to refer to the facts of life. We see that man passes through birth and growth and old age, that he experiences sin, sickness, and death, that he sorrows and suffers, aspires and rejoices, and that he is ever looking forward to greater purity and striving toward perfection. These are not opinions, speculations, or metaphysics. They are universal facts. If man were already perfect, there would be no need for him to be perfected, and all moral teaching would be useless and ridiculous. Moreover, a perfect being could not be subject to illusion and unreality. On the other hand, if a man could never attain to purity and perfection, his aspirations and strivings would be useless. They would indeed be mockeries, and the heavenly perfection of saintly and divine men would have to be belittled and denied. We see around us sin and sorrow and suffering, and we see before us in the lives of the great teachers the sinless, sorrowless, divine state. Therefore, we know that man is an imperfect being, yet capable of and destined for perfection. The divine state toward which he aspires, he will reach. The fact that he so ardently desires it means that he can reach it, even if the fact were not demonstrated in those great ones who have already attained. Man is not a compound of two beings, one real and perfect, the other unreal and imperfect. He is one and real, and his experiences are real. His imperfection is apparent, and his advancement and progress are also apparent. The realities of life claim men in spite of their metaphysics, and all come under the same law of change and progress. He who affirms the eternal sinlessness and perfection of man should not, to be logical and consistent, ever speak of sins and faults, of disease and death. Yet he refers to these things as matters to be dealt with. Thus, in theory, he denies the existence of that which he habitually recognizes in practice. He also who denies the possibility of perfection should not aspire or strive, yet we find him practicing self-denial and striving ceaselessly toward perfection. Holding to the theoretical does not absolve men from the inevitable. The teacher of the unreality of sickness, old age, and death is at last caught in the toils of disease, succumbs to age, and disappears in death. Change is not only inevitable, it is constant and unvarying law. Without it, everything would remain forever as it is, and there could be neither growth nor progress. The strenuous struggle of all life is a prophecy of its perfection. The lookings upward of all beings is evidence of their ceaseless ascension. Aspirations, ideals, moral aims, while they denote man's imperfection, assuredly point to his future perfection. They are neither unnecessary nor aimless, but are woven into the fabric of things. They belong to the vital essence of the universe. Whatsoever a man believes or disbelieves, what theories he holds or does not hold, one thing is certain. He is found in the stream of life and must think and act. And to think and act is to experience, and to experience is to change and develop. That man is conscious of sin means that he can become pure. That he abhors evil signifies that he can reach up to good. That he is a pilgrim in the land of error assures us, without doubt, that he will at last come to the beautiful city of truth. Light on the truth of transitoriness. It is well sometimes to meditate deeply and seriously on the truth of transitoriness. By meditation we will come to perceive how all compounded things must pass away, yea, how even while they remain, they are already in process of passing away. Such meditation will soften the heart, deepen the understanding, and render one more fully conscious of the sacred nature of life. What is there that does not pass away among all the things of which a man says, "This will be mine tomorrow"? Even the mind is continually changing. Old characteristics die and pass away, and new ones are formed. In the midst of life, all things are dying. Nothing endures. Nothing can be retained. Things appear and then disappear. They become and then they pass away. The ancient sages declared the visible universe to be Maya, illusion, meaning thereby that impermanency is the antithesis of reality. Change and decay are in the very nature of visible things, and they are unreal, illusory, in the sense that they pass away forever. He who would ascend into the realm of reality, who would penetrate into the world of truth, must first perceive with no uncertain vision the transitory nature of the things of life. He must cease to delude himself into believing that he can retain his hold on his possessions, his body, his pleasures, and objects of pleasure. For as the flower fades, and as the leaves of the tree fall and wither, so must these things, in their season, pass away forever. The perception of the truth of transitoriness is one of the first great steps in wisdom. For when it is fully grasped and its lesson has sunk deeply into the heart, the clinging to perishable things, which is the cause of all sorrow, will be yielded up, and the search for the truth which abides will be accelerated. Anguish is rife because men set their hearts on the acquisition of things that perish, because they lust for the possession of those things which even when obtained cannot be retained. There is no sorrow that would not vanish if the clinging to evanescent things were given up. There is no grief that would not be dispersed if the desire to have and to hold those things, which in their very nature cannot endure, were taken out of the heart. Tens of thousands of grief-stricken hearts are today bewailing the loss of some loved object which they called theirs in days that are past, are weeping over that which is gone forever and cannot be restored. Men are slow to learn the lessons of experience and to acquire wisdom, and unnumbered griefs and pains and sorrows have failed to impress them with the truth of transitoriness. He who clings to that which is impermanent cannot escape sorrow, and the intensity of his sorrow will be measured by the strength of his clinging. He who sets his heart on perishable things embraces the companionship of grief and lamentation. Men cannot find wisdom because they will not renounce the clinging to things, because they believe that the clinging to perishable objects is the source of happiness and not the cause of sorrow. They cannot escape unrest and enter into the life of peace because desire is difficult to quench, and the immediate and transitory pleasure which gratified desire affords is mistaken for abiding joy. It is because the true order of things is not understood that grief is universal. It is ignorance of the fleeting nature of things that lies at the root of sorrow. The sting of anguish will be taken out of life when the lust to hold and to preserve the things of decay is taken out of the heart. Sorrow is ended for him who sees things as they are, who, realizing the nature of transiency, detaches his heart and mind from the things that perish. There is a right use for perishable things, and when they are rightly used and not doted upon for themselves alone, their loss will cause no sorrow. If a rich man thinks in his heart, "My riches and possessions are no part of me, nor can I call them mine, seeing that when I am summoned to depart from this world, I cannot take them with me. They are entrusted to me to use rightly, and I will employ them to the best of my ability for the good of men and for the world." Such a man, though surrounded by luxuries and responsibilities, will be lifted above sorrow and will draw near to truth. On the other hand, if the poor man does not covet riches and possessions, his condition will cause him no anxiety and unrest. He who by a right understanding of life rids his heart of all selfish grasping and clinging, who uses everything wisely and in its proper place, and who with chastened heart and mind clarified of all thirsty desires remains serene and self-contained in the midst of all changes, such a man will find truth. He will stand face to face with reality. For in the midst of all error there abides the truth. At the heart of transiency there reposes the permanent, and illusion does but veil the eternal and unchanging reality. The nature of that reality is not my purpose to deal with here. Let it suffice that I indicate that it is only found by abandoning in the heart all that is not of love and compassion and wisdom and purity. In these things there is no element of transitoriness, no sorrow, and no unrest. When the truth of transitoriness is well perceived, and when the lesson contained in the truth of transitoriness is well learned, then does a man set out to find the abiding truth. Then does he wean his heart from those selfish elements which are productive of sorrow. He whose treasure is truth, who fashions his life in accordance with wisdom, will find the joy which does not pass away, will leave behind him the land of lamentation, and, crossing the wide ocean of illusion, will come to the sorrowless shore. The light that never goes out. Amid the multitude of conflicting opinions and theories, and caught in the struggle of existence, whither shall the confused truth-seeker turn to find the path that leads to peace unending? To what refuge shall he fly from the uncertainties and sorrows of change? Will he find peace in pleasure? Pleasure has its place, and in its place it is good, but as an end, as a refuge, it affords no shelter, and he who seeks it as such does but increase the anguish of life. For what is more fleeting than pleasure, and what is more empty than the heart that seeks satisfaction in so ephemeral a thing? There is, therefore, no abiding refuge in pleasure. Will he find peace in wealth and worldly success? Wealth and worldly success have their place, but they are fickle and uncertain possessions, and he who seeks them for themselves alone will be burdened with many anxieties and cares. And when the storms of adversity sweep over his glittering yet frail habitation, he will find himself helpless and exposed. But even should he maintain such possessions throughout life, what satisfaction will they afford him in the hour of death? There is no abiding refuge in wealth and worldly success. Will he find peace in health? Health has its place, and it should not be thrown away or despised. But it belongs to the body which is destined for dissolution, and is therefore perishable. Even should health be maintained for 100 years, the time will come when the physical energies will decline, and debility and decay will overtake them. There is no abiding refuge in health. Will he find refuge in those whom he dearly loves? Those whom he loves have their place in his life. They afford him means of practicing unselfishness, and therefore of arriving at truth. He should cherish them with loving care and consider their needs before his own. But the time will come when they will be separated from him, and he will be left alone. There is no abiding refuge in loved ones. Will he find peace in this scripture or that? Scripture fills an important place. As a guide it is good, but it cannot be a refuge, for one may know the Scripture by heart and yet be in sore conflict and unrest. The theories of men are subject to successive changes, and no limit can be set to the variety of textual interpretations. There is no abiding refuge in Scripture. Will he find rest in this teacher or that? The teacher has his place, and as an instructor he renders good service. But teachers are numerous, and their differences are many. Though one may regard his particular teacher as in possession of truth, that teacher will one day be taken from him. There is no abiding refuge in a teacher. Will he find peace in solitude? Solitude is good and necessary in its place, but he who courts it as a lasting refuge will be like one perishing of thirst in a waterless desert. He will escape men and the turmoil of the city, but he will not escape himself and the unrest of his heart. There is no abiding rest in solitude. If then the seeker can find no refuge in pleasure, in success, in health, in friends, in Scripture, in the teacher, or in solitude, whither shall he turn to find that sanctuary which shall afford abiding peace? Let him take refuge in righteousness. Let him fly to the sanctuary of a purified heart. Let him enter the pathway of a blameless, stainless life, and walk it meekly and patiently until it brings him to the eternal temple of truth in his own heart. He who has taken refuge in truth, even in the habitation of a wise understanding and a loving and steadfast heart, is the same whether in pleasure or pain, wealth or poverty, success or failure, health or sickness, with friends or without, in solitude or noisy haunts. And he is independent of Bibles and teachers, for the Spirit of truth instructs him. He perceives without fear or sorrow the change and decay which are in all things. He has found peace. He has entered the abiding sanctuary. He knows the light that will never go out. What You Can Do with Your Willpower by Russell H. Conwell. Preface. Other writers have fully and accurately described the road, and my only hope is that these hastily written lines will inspire the young man or young woman to arise and go. What You Can Do with Your Willpower. Part 1. Success has no secret. Her voice is forever ringing through the marketplace and crying in the wilderness, and the burden of her cry is one word: will. Any normal young man who hears and heeds that cry is equipped fully to climb to the very heights of life. The message I would like to leave with the young men and women of America is a message I have been trying humbly to deliver from lecture platform and pulpit for more than 50 years. It is a message the accuracy of which has been affirmed and reaffirmed in thousands of lives whose progress I have been privileged to watch. And the message is this: your future stands before you like a block of unwrought marble. You can work it into what you will. Neither heredity, nor environment, nor any obstacles superimposed by man can keep you from marching straight through to success, provided you are guided by a firm, driving determination and have normal health and intelligence. Determination is the battery that commands every road of life. It is the armor against which the missiles of adversity rattle harmlessly. If there is one thing I have tried peculiarly to do through these years, it is to indent in the minds of the youth of America the living fact that when they give will the reins and say drive, they are headed toward the heights. The institution out of which Temple University of Philadelphia grew was founded 30 years ago expressly to furnish opportunities for higher education to poor boys and girls who are willing to work for it. I have seen 90,000 students enter its doors. A very large percentage of these came to Philadelphia without money, but firmly determined to get an education. I have never known one of them to go back defeated. Determination has the properties of a powerful acid. All shackles melt before it. Conversely, lack of willpower is the readiest weapon in the arsenal of failure. The most hopeless proposition in the world is the fellow who thinks that success is a door through which he will sometimes stumble if he roams around long enough. Some men seem to expect ravens to feed them, the cruse of oil to remain inexhaustible, the fish to come right up over the side of the boat at mealtime. They believe that life is a series of miracles. They loaf about and trust in their lucky star and boldly declare that the world owes them a living. As a matter of fact, the world owes a man nothing that he does not earn. In this life, a man gets about what he is worth, and he must render an equivalent for what is given him. There is no such thing as inactive success. My mind is running back over the stories of thousands of boys and girls I have known and known about, who have faced every sort of a handicap and have won out solely by will and perseverance in working with all the power that God had given them. It is now nearly 30 years since a young English boy came into my office. He wanted to attend the evening classes at our university to learn oratory. "Why don't you go into the law?" I asked him. "I'm too poor. I haven't a chance," he replied, shaking his head sadly. I turned on him sharply. "Of course you haven't a chance," I exclaimed, "if you don't make up your mind to it." The next night he knocked at my door again. His face was radiant, and there was a light of determination in his eyes. "I have decided to become a lawyer," he said, and I knew from the ring of his voice that he meant it. Many times after he became mayor of Philadelphia, he must have looked back on that decision as the turning point in his life. I am thinking of a young Connecticut farm lad who was given up by his teachers as too weak-minded to learn. He left school when he was 7 years old and toiled on his father's farm until he was 21. Then something turned his mind toward the origin and development of the animal kingdom. He began to read works on zoology, and in order to enlarge his capacity for understanding, went back to school and picked up where he left off 14 years before. Somebody said to him, "You can get to the top if you will." He grasped the hope and nurtured it, until at last it completely possessed him. He entered college at 28 and worked his way through with the assistance that we were able to furnish him. Today he is a respected professor of zoology in an Ohio college. Such illustrations I could multiply indefinitely. Of all the boys whom I have tried to help through college, I cannot think of a single one who has failed for any other reason than ill health. But of course, I have never helped anyone who was not first helping himself. As soon as a man determines the goal toward which he is marching, he is in a strategic position to see and seize everything that will contribute toward that end. Whenever a young man tells me that if he had his way he would be a lawyer or an engineer or whatnot, I always reply, "You can be what you will, provided that it is something the world will be demanding 10 years hence." This brings to my mind a certain stipulation which the ambition of youth must recognize. You must invest yourself or your money in a known demand. You must select an occupation that is fitted to your own special genius and to some actual want of the people. Choose as early as possible what your life work will be. Then you can be continually equipping yourself by reading and observing to a purpose. There are many things which the average boy or girl learns in school that could be learned outside just as well. Almost any man should be able to become wealthy in this land of opulent opportunity. There are some people who think that to be pious they must be very poor and very dirty. They are wrong. Not money, but the love of money is the root of all evil. Money in itself is a dynamic force for helping humanity. In my lectures, I have borne heavily on the fact that we are all walking over acres of diamonds and mines of gold. There are people who think that their fortune lies in some far country. It is much more likely to lie right in their own backyards or on their front doorstep, hidden from their unseeing eye. Most of our millionaires discovered their fortunes by simply looking around them. Recently, I have been investigating the lives of 4,043 American millionaires. All but 20 of them started life as poor boys, and all but 40 of them have contributed largely to their communities and divided fairly with their employees as they went along. But alas, not one rich man's son out of 17 dies rich. But if a man has dilly-dallied through a certain space of wasted years, can he then develop the character, the motor force to drive him to success? Why, my friend, willpower can not only be developed, but it is often dry powder which needs only a match. Very frequently I think of the life of Abraham Lincoln, that wonderful man, and I am thankful that I was permitted to meet him. Yet Abraham Lincoln developed the splendid sinews of his will after he was 21. Before that, he was just a roving, good-natured sort of chap. Always have I regretted that I failed to ask him what special circumstance broke the chrysalis of his life and loosened the wings of his will. Many years ago, some of the students of Temple University held a meeting in a building opposite the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. As they were leaving the building, they noticed a foreigner selling peanuts on the opposite curb. While buying peanuts, they got to talking with the fellow and told him that anyone could obtain an education if he was willing to work for it. Eagerly, the poor fellow drank up all the information he could get. He enrolled at Temple University and worked his way through, starting with the elementary studies. He is today an eminent practicing physician in the national capital. Often I think of an office clerk who reached a decision that the ambitions which were stirring in his soul could be realized if he could only get an education. He attended our evening classes and was graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree. He is now the millionaire head of one of the largest brokerage houses in the country. Where there's a will, there's a way, but one needs to use a little common sense about selecting the way. A general may determine to win a victory, but if he hurls his troops across an open field straight into the leaden sweep of the enemy's artillery, he invites disaster and defeat. The best general lays his plans carefully and advances his troops in the way that will best conserve their strength and numbers. So must a man plan his campaign of life. No man has a right, either for himself or for others, to be at work in a factory or a store or anywhere else unless he would work there from choice, money or no money, if he had the necessities of life. As a man thinks, so he is, says the writer of Proverbs. But as a man adjusts himself, so really is he after all. One great trouble with many individuals is that they are made up of all sorts of machinery that is not adjusted, that is out of place. No belts on the wheels, no fire under the boiler, hence no steam to move the mechanism. Some folk never take the trouble to size themselves up, to find out what they are fitted to do, and then wonder why they remain way down at the bottom of the heap. I remember a young woman who told me that she did not believe she could ever be of any particular use in the world. I mentioned a dozen things that she ought to be able to do. If you only knew yourself, I said, you would set yourself to writing. You ought to be an author. She shook her head and smiled as if she thought I was making fun of her. Later, force of circumstances drove her to take up the pen, and when she came to me and told me that she was making $3,000 a year in literary work and was soon to go higher, I thought back to the time when she was a poor girl making $3 a week, when she failed accurately to estimate herself. Part 2. There is a deplorable tendency among many people to wait for a particularly favorable opportunity to declare themselves in the battle of life. Some people pause for the rap of opportunity when opportunity has been playing a tattoo on their resonant skulls for years. Hardly a single great invention has been placed on the market without a number of men putting forth the claim that they had the idea first, and in most cases they proved the fact. But while they were sitting down and dreaming or trying to bring the device to a greater perfection, a man with initiative rose up and acted. The telegraph, telephone, sewing machine, air brake, mowing machine, wireless, and linotype machine are only a few illustrations. The most wonderful idea is quite valueless until it is put into practical operation. The government rewards the man who first gets a patent or first puts his invention into practical use, and the world does likewise. Thus, the dreamer must always lag behind the door. True willpower also predicates concentration. I shall never forget the time I went to see President Lincoln to ask him to spare the life of one of my soldiers who was sentenced to be shot. As I walked toward the door of his office, I felt a greater fear than I had ever known when the shells were bursting all about us at Antietam. Finally, I mustered up courage to knock on the door. I heard a voice inside yell, "Come in and sit down." The man at the table did not look up as I entered. He was busy over a bunch of papers. I sat down at the edge of a chair and wished I were in Peking or Patagonia. He never looked up until he had quite finished with the papers. Then he turned to me and said, "I am a very busy man and have only a few minutes to spare. Tell me in the fewest words what it is you want." As soon as I mentioned the case, he said, "I have heard all about it and you do not need to tell me any more. Mr. Stanton was talking to me about that only a few days ago. You can go to the hotel and rest assured that the President never did sign an order to shoot a boy under 20 and never will. You may tell his mother that." Then, after a short conversation, he took a hold of another bunch of papers and said decidedly, "Good morning." Lincoln, one of the greatest men of the world, owed his success largely to one rule. Whatsoever he had to do at all, he put his whole mind into, and he held it there until the task was all done. That makes men great almost anywhere. Too many people are satisfied if they have done a thing well enough. That is a fatal complacency. Well enough has cursed souls. Well enough has wrecked enterprises. Well enough has destroyed nations. If perfection in a task can possibly be reached, nothing short of perfection is well enough. Governor Talbot of Massachusetts got his high office because General Swift made a happy application of the truth in saying to the convention, "I nominate for governor of this state a man who, when he was a farmer's boy, hoed to the end of the row." That saying became a campaign slogan all up and down the state. He hoed to the end of the row. He hoed to the end of the row. When the people discovered that this was one of the characteristics of the man, they elected him by one of the greatest majorities ever given a governor in Massachusetts. Yet we must bear in mind that there is such a thing as overdoing anything. Young people should draw a line between study that secures wisdom and study that breaks down the mind, between exercise that is helpful and exercise that is injurious, between a conscientiousness that is pure and divine and a conscientiousness that is overmorbid and insane, between economy that is careful and economy that is stingy, between industry that is a reasonable use of their powers and industry that is an overuse of their powers, leading only to destruction. The best ordered mind is one that can grasp the problems that gather around a man constantly and work them out to a logical conclusion, that sees quickly what anything means, whether it be an exhibition of goods, a juxtaposition of events, or the suggestions of literature. A man is made up largely of his daily observations. School training serves to fit and discipline him so that he may read rightly the lesson of the things he sees around him. Men have made mighty fortunes by just using their eyes. Several years ago, I took dinner in New York with one of the great millionaires of that city. In the course of our talk, he told me something about his boyhood days, how with hardly a penny in his pocket, he slung a pack on his back and set out along the Erie Canal looking for a job. At last he got one. He was paid $3 a week to make soft soap for the laborers to use at the locks in washing their hands. One can hardly imagine a more humble occupation, but this boy kept his eyes open. He saw the disadvantages of soft soap and set to work to make a hard substitute for it. Finally, he succeeded, and his success brought him many, many millions. Every person is designed for a definite work in life, fitted for a particular sphere. Before God, he has a right to that sphere. If you are an excellent housekeeper, you should not be running a loom, and it is your duty to prepare yourself to enter at the first opportunity the sphere for which you are fitted. George W. Childs, who owned the Philadelphia Ledger, once blacked boots and sold newspapers in front of the Ledger building. He told me how he used to look at that building and declare over and over to himself that someday he would own the great newspaper establishment that it housed. When he mentioned his ambition to his associates, they laughed at him. But Childs had indomitable grit, and ultimately he did come to own that newspaper establishment, one of the finest in the country. Another thing very necessary to the pursuit of success is the proper employment of waiting moments. How do you use your waiting time for meals, for trains, for business? I suppose that if the average individual were to employ wisely these intervals in which he whistles and twiddles his thumbs, he would soon accumulate enough knowledge to quite make over his life. I went through the United States Senate in 1867 and asked each of the members how he got his early education. I found that an extremely large percentage of them had simply properly applied their waiting moments. Even Charles Sumner, a university graduate, told me that he learned more from the books he read outside of college than from those he had studied within. General Burnside, who was then a senator, said that he had always had a book beside him in the shop where he worked. Before leaving the subject of the power of the will, there is one thing I would like to say. A true will must have a decent regard for the happiness of others. Do not get so wrapped up in your own mission that you forget to be kind to other people, for you have not fulfilled every duty unless you have fulfilled the duty of being pleasant. Enemies and ignorance are the two most expensive things in a man's life. I never make unnecessary enemies. They cost too much. Everyone has within himself the tools necessary to carve out success. Consecrate yourself to some definite mission in life, and let it be a mission that will benefit the world as well as yourself. Remember that nothing can withstand the sweep of a determined will, unless it happens to be another will equally as determined. Keep clean, fight hard, pick your openings judiciously, and have your eyes forever fixed on the heights toward which you are headed. If there be any other formula for success, I do not know it. Part 3. The biography of that great patriot and statesman, Daniel Manin of Venice, Italy, contains a very romantic example of the possibilities of will force. He was born in a poor quarter of the city. His parents were without rank or money. Venice in 1805 was under the Austrian rule and was sharply divided into aristocratic and peasant classes. He was soon deserted by his father and left to the support of his mother. He was a dull boy and could not keep along with other boys in the church schools. His mind labored as slowly as did the childhood intellects of many of the greatest men of history. Daniel seemed destined to earn his living digging mud out of the canals if he supported himself at all. No American boy can be handicapped like that. But the children who learn slowly learn surely, and history, which is but the biography of great men, mentions again and again the fact that the great characters began to be able to acquire learning late in life. Napoleon and Wellington were both dull boys, and Lincoln often said that he was a dunce through his early years. Daniel Manin seems to have been utterly unable to learn from books until he was 8 or 10 years old. But his latent willpower was suddenly developed to an unexpected degree when he was quite a youth. Kossuth, who was a personal friend of Manin, said in an address in New York that the American Republic was responsible for the awakening of Manin and through him had made Italy free. It appears that an American sea captain, while discharging a cargo in Venice, employed Daniel as an errand boy, and when the ship sailed, the captain made Daniel a present of a gilt-edged copy of the lives of George Washington and John Hancock in one volume. The captain, who had greatly endeared himself to Daniel, made the boy promise solemnly that he would learn to read the book. But Daniel was utterly ignorant of the English language in print and had learned only a few phrases from the captain. The gift of that book made Venice a republic, led to the adoption of sections of the United States Constitution by that state, and carried the principles on into the Constitution of United Italy. That book awakened the sleeping willpower of the industrious, dull boy. Even his mother protested against his waste of time in trying to read English when he was unable to conquer the primers in Italian. But he secured a phrase book and a grammar, and paid for them in hard labor. With those crude implements, without a teacher, he determined to read that book. Only one friend, a young priest in St. Mark's Cathedral, gave him any word or look of encouragement. But his candle burned late, and the returning daylight took him to his book to study until time for breakfast. Then came the daily task as a messenger or gondolier. Some weeks or months after he began his seemingly foolish problem, he rushed into his mother's room at night, excited and noisy, shouting to her, "I can read that book! I can read that book!" There comes a moment in the life of every successful student of a foreign language when he suddenly awakens to the consciousness that he can think in that language. From that point on, the work is always easy. It must have been a similar psychological change which came into Daniel's intellect. So sudden was it, so amazing the change, that the priests reported the case as a miracle, and the little circle of the poor people who knew the boy looked on him with awe. Consul General Sparks, who represented the United States at Venice in 1848, wrote that Manin often mentions his intellectual new birth, and his success in reading the life of Washington in English spurs him on in the difficult and dangerous undertakings connected with the efforts of Venice to get free. When Daniel began to appreciate his ability to determine to do and to persevere, his ambition and hope brought him to larger views of life. He resolved to learn in other ways. He took up school books and mastered them thoroughly, and he became known as a boy who works slowly, but what he does at all, he does well. He soon found helpers among kind gentlemen and secured employment in a bookstall. The accounts of his persistence and his achievements are as thrilling and as fascinating as any finished romance. He managed to get a college education recognized by Padua University. He studied law and was admitted to the bar when he was 22 years of age. The Austrian judges would not admit him to their courts, and it is said he visited his law office regularly and daily for nearly 2 years before he had a paying client. But his strong will, shown in his perseverance in the presence of starvation, won the respect and love of the daughter of a wealthy patrician. They had been married but a short time when the Austrians confiscated the property of his father-in-law because of suspicions circulated concerning his secret connection with the Americani. That patriotic secret society was called the Carbonari by the Austrians, and Manin became the leading spirit in the Venetian branch. His will seemed resistless. He refused the presidency in 1832, when revolution shook the tyrannies of all Europe, and Venice fell back under Austrian control. But in 1848 he was almost unanimously elected president of the American Republic of Venice. And in his second proclamation before the great siege began, he issued a call for the election, using, as Consul General Sparks records, the following language as translated. And until the election is held and the officers installed, the following sections of the Constitution of the United States of America shall be the law of the city. He was determined to secure an American Republic in Italy. He lived to see it in Venice. Statues of Daniel Manin are now seen in all the great cities of Italy, and when the statue was dedicated at Venice, and a city park square named after him, he was called the father of the new kingdom of Italy. General Garibaldi said that when Manin made a draft of the Constitution he proposed for United Italy, he quoted the American Declaration of Independence. The general also said that Manin insisted the government of Italy should be like the American Republic, and that it was difficult to convince Manin that a king, so called, could be as limited as a president. Even Mazzini, the extremist, and both Cavour and Gavazzi finally came to accept Manin's demands for freedom and equality as they were set forth in the Constitution of the American Republic. Manin did not live to see the final union, nor to see his son a general in the Italian army, but his vigorous will gave a momentum to freedom in Italy, which is still pressing the people on to his noblest ideals. What man has done, man can do, and what Manin did can be done again in other achievements. The normal reader never was anxious that the North Pole should be located, and he does not care now whether it has been discovered. Mathematicians and geographers may find delight in the solution of some abstract problem, but the busy citizen who seizes his paper with haste to see if Perry has found the North Pole has no interest in the spot. He would not visit the place if some authority would give him 1,000 acres or present him with a dozen ice floes. What the reader desires is to learn how the willpower in those discoverers worked out through hairbreadth escapes, long winters, and starvation's pangs. It is a great game, and the world is a grandstand. The man with the strongest will attracts the admiration of the world. All the world which loves a lover also admires a hero, and a hero is always a man of forceful will. When we read of Louis Joliet and James Marquette in their terrible experience tracing the Mississippi River, Indians as savage as wild beasts, marshes, lakes, forests, mountains, burdens, illness, wounds, exhaustion, seeming failures, all testify to their sublime strength of purpose. Peter Lemoyne, Jonathan Carver, Captain Lewis, Lieutenant Clark, Montgomery Pike, General Fremont, Elisha Kent Kane, Charles Francis Hall, David Livingstone, Captain Cook, Paul Duchaillu, and Henry M. Stanley carve their names deep in walls of history when differing from other men only in the cultivation of a mighty will. Mary Lyon, the heroine of Mount Holyoke, used to quote frequently the saying of Dr. Beecher that he once had a machine admirably contrived, admirably adjusted, but it had one fault: it wouldn't go. While Catherine Beecher would retort that Miss Lyon had too much go for so small a machine. But what a monumental triumph was the dedication of the first building of Mount Holyoke College at South Hadley, Massachusetts. Mrs. Deacon Porter wrote to Henry Ward Beecher, "I wish you could have seen Miss Lyon's face as the procession moved up the street. It was indeed the face of an angel." From that immortal hour when that little woman, peeling potatoes as her brother's housekeeper at Buckland, Massachusetts, suddenly determined to start a movement for the higher education of young women, she had written, had traveled, had begged, had given all her inheritance, had visited colleges and schools, going incessantly working, praying, appealing, until the material embodiment of her martyr sacrifices was opened to women. All women in all countries are greatly in her debt. Men feel grateful for what the higher education of women has done for men. One cannot now walk over the embowered campus of Mount Holyoke College without meditating on what a forceful will of a frail woman, set toward the beautiful and good, can do within the severest limitations. Vassar, Wellesley, Smith, Bryn Mawr, and the 35 other colleges for women in western and southern states are the children of Mount Holyoke. One lone woman, one single will, a large heart. God sees her and orders his forces to aid her. Richard Arkwright, Stephenson, and Edison, in the pursuit of an invention, with stern faces and clenched teeth, work far into the morning. John Wesley, Whitefield, and the list of religious reformers from St. Augustine to Dwight L. Moody have been men of dynamic confidence in the triumph of a great idea. Neil Dow, Elizabeth Fry, and their disciples, urging on the cause of temperance with that motive force which they discovered in themselves, aroused the people wherever they went to assistance or to opposition. Fulton said, "I will build a steamboat." Cyrus Field said, "I will lay a telegraph cable to Europe." Sir Christopher Wren, imitating the builders of St. Peter's, said, "I will build the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral." General Washington said, "I will venture all on final victory." And General Grant said, "I will fight it out on this line." When Abraham Lincoln gave his eloquent tribute to Henry Clay in 1852, he said, "Henry Clay's example teaches us that one can scarcely be so poor, but that, if he will, he can acquire sufficient education to get through the world respectably." To such men log cabins were universities. Daniel Webster decided at the end of his day's work, plowing a stony field in the New Hampshire hills, that he would be a statesman. Thomas H. Benton, when nearly all men supposed the wilderness unconquerable, decided to push the Republic west to the Rocky Mountains. Salmon P. Chase, from the time he ran the ferry boat on the Cuyahoga River, kept in his pocketbook a motto, "Where there is a will, there is a way." Charles Sumner had a disagreeable habit of talking about himself and boasting of his learning. He was frankly told one day by James T. Fields that it was a weakening trait. Mr. Sumner thanked Mr. Fields and told him that he had determined to discontinue such foolish talk. He fought himself, wrote Mr. Fields, and he conquered. James G. Blaine, in college at Washington, Pennsylvania, saw a student who had been too devoted to football weeping over his failure to pass an examination. Warned by the failure of this student, James told his mother that he would not play another game of football while he was in college. He kept his resolution unbroken throughout the course. When James A. Garfield was earning his tuition as a bell ringer at Hiram College, he resolved that the first stroke of the bell should be exactly on the minute throughout the year. The president of the college stated that the people in the village set their clocks by that bell, and not once in the year was it 1 minute ahead or behind time. Grover Cleveland, at 18, was drifting about from one job to another, and men prophesied that he would be a disgrace to his over-pious father, who was a preacher. Mr. Cleveland said in a speech that, like Martin Luther, I was stopped in my course by a stroke of lightning. It does not appear to what he referred, but it does appear that he decided firmly that he would choose some calling and stick to it. He decided upon the law, and was so fixed in his determination to know law, that he stayed in his tutor's office 3 years after he had been admitted to the bar, and there continued persistently in his studies. Part 4. In a small town in western Massachusetts 40 years ago, a young pale youth was acting as cashier of the savings bank. He was dyspeptic, acutely nervous, and often ill-natured. One day several large factories closed their doors, and the corporations to whom the bank had loaned money gave notice of bankruptcy. The president of the bank was in Europe, and the people did not know that the bank was a loser by the failure. The cashier was almost overcome by the sense of danger, for he could not meet a run on the bank with the funds he had on hand. He entered the bank after a sleepless night, fearing that the people might in some way learn of the bank's responsibility. He was sleepy, faint, discouraged. an old farmer came in to get a small check cashed, and the glum cashier did not answer the farmer's usual salutation. His face was cloudy, his eyes bloodshot, and his whole manner irritating. He counted out the money and threw it at the farmer. The old man counted his money carefully and then called out to the cashier, "What's the matter? Is your bank going to fail?" When the farmer had left the bank, the young cashier could see that his manner was letting out that which he wished to conceal. He then paced up and down the bank and fought it all out with himself. He determined he would be cheerful, brave, and strong. He forced himself to smile, and soon was able to laugh at himself for presenting such a ridiculous appearance. He met the next customer with a hearty greeting of good cheer. All the forenoon he grew stronger in his determination to let nothing move him to gloom again. About noon, the daily Boston paper came and announced the possible failure of that bank. Almost instantly the news flew about town, and a wild mob assailed the bank, screaming for their money. But the cheerful cashier met them with a smile and made fun of their excitement. The 18th man demanding his money was an old German who, seeing the cashier count out the money so coolly and cheerfully, drew back his bank book and said, "If you have the money, we don't want it now, but we thought you didn't have it." That suggestion made the crowd laugh, and in half an hour the crowd had left, and those who had drawn their money in many cases asked the cashier to take it back. The cashier now is a most successful manufacturer and railroad director, stout-hearted and cheerful. He often refers to the fight he had that morning with his insignificant, flabby little self. To appreciate one's power at command is the first consideration. A man from Cooperstown, New York, visited St. Anthony Falls, Minnesota in the early 50s of the last century and laughed loud and long at the ridiculous little mill which turned out a few bags of flour and sawed a few thousand feet of lumber. It was indeed ludicrous. He could think of no comparison except an elephant drawing a baby's tin toy. His laughter led to a heated discussion and investigation. An Army officer at Fort Snelling, who was a civil engineer, was asked to make an estimate of the Mississippi River's horsepower at St. Anthony Falls. His report was beyond the civilian's belief. He said there was power enough to turn the wheels to grind out 10,000 barrels of flour a day and to cut logs into millions of square feet of board every hour. The estimate was below the facts, but was not accepted for 10 years. Then was constructed the strong dam which built up the great city of Minneapolis and represents the finest and most vigorous civilization of our age. Nevertheless, there still runs to waste 10,000 horsepower. In the first paper mill erected at South Hadley Falls, Massachusetts, the horsepower used was less than 100, yet an engineer employed by Mr. Chapin of Springfield to determine the possible power of the Connecticut River at that point reported it was so great that unbelief in his figures postponed for a long time all the proposed enterprises. But one poor man, determined to do something about it, promoted a system of canals which now so utilizes the water that a large city, manufacturing annually products worth many millions, draws from it comfort and riches. Massive as are the present works at Holyoke, regret is often expressed that so much of the water power still goes over the mighty dam and ridicules the smallness of the faith of those who tried to harness it. Such is the intellectual force in a young person's mind. It is reasonable to conclude that no mind ever did its very best, and that no willpower was ever exerted continuously to its greatest capacity. But the first essential in the making of noble character is to gain a full appreciation of the latent or unused force which each individual possesses. When one without foolish egotism realizes how much can be done with his wasting energies, then he must carefully consider to what object he will turn his power. Great wills are often wasted on unworthy objects, and the strong current of the mind, which could be applied to the making of world-enriching machinery, is used to manufacture some unsaleable toy. The mind is often compared to an electric dynamo. The figure is accurate. It is an automatic self-charging battery which, when applied to worthy occupation or to a high purpose, distributes happiness, progress, and intelligence to mankind, and as a natural consequence, brings riches and honors to the industrious possessor. 40 years ago, there was on the lips of nearly every teacher and father a fascinating story of a Massachusetts boy whose history illustrates forcibly the power to will which is latent in us all. I need not state the details of the life, as it is only the illustration which we need here. A young fellow sat on a barrel at the door of a country grocery store in a small village not far from Boston. He was the son of an industrious mechanic who had opened a small shop for making and repairing farm utensils, such as rakes, hoes, and shovels. But the son, encouraged by an indulgent mother, would not work. He gave way to cards, drink, and bad company. He would not go to school and was a continual source of alarm to his parents, and he became the talk of the neighbors. He either was ill with a cough or pretended to fear consumption. The doctor's advice to set him at work in the open air was not enforced by his anxious mother. He was a fair sample of the many thousand young men seen now about the country stores and taverns. He had, however, the unusual disadvantage of having his board and clothing furnished to him without earning them. If he exercised his will, it was to turn it against himself in a determined self-indulgence. I heard him once refer to those days and quote Virgil in saying that the descent to Avernus is easy. One evening, with his hands in his pockets, he strolled up to the store and post office to meet some other young men for a game of checkers. Under the only street lamp near the store, a patent medicine peddler had opened one side of his covered wagon and was advertising his universal cure. The boy, then about 19 years old, listened listlessly to the songs and stories, but was not interested enough to learn what was offered for sale. The vendor of medicines held up a chain composed of several seemingly solid rings, which he skillfully took apart. He then offered $1 to anyone who would put the rings together as they were before. The puzzle caught the eye and interest of the careless boy. As the rings were passed from one to another, they came to him. He looked them over and said, "I can't do it," and passed them on. The Yankee peddler yelled at the boy, "If you talk like that, you will land in the poorhouse." The young fellow was cut to the heart with the short rebuke. He was inclined to answer hotly, but lacked the courage. After the other boys had had their chance to see the rings, he asked to examine them again, but he still saw no way to cut or open the solid steel, and contemptuously threw them at the peddler and shouted, "You're fooling, that can't be done." The smiling vendor rolled the rings into a chain in an instant, and throwing it to the boy said sarcastically, "Take it home to your mother, she can do it." The young fellow, ashamed, angry, and crushed, caught the chain and crept out of the crowd and went home, entering his room by the back stairs. He hated the peddler with a murderous passion, but despised himself and must have wept great tears far into the night. The next morning he sat on the side of his bed, gazing at the chain long after his father had gone to work. That was a terrible battle. All who succeed must fight that battle to victory at some time, or life is a failure. He who conquers himself can conquer other men. He who does not rule himself cannot control other people. For the first time, that boy was conscious of his lack of will. He was painfully ashamed. He could not again meet the boys or the one girl who was at the post office unless he solved that riddle. It was far worse to him than the riddles of the ancient oracles or the questions of Samson had been to the ancients. No victory so glorious to any man as that when he rises over his dead self and can shout with unwavering confidence, "I will." That young man's battle was furious and a strain on body and soul. He kept saying over and over again, "I will solve that riddle." He was sorely tempted by hunger as he would not stop to eat. He determined to win out alone and did not ask aid even of his mother. That night the rings fell apart in his hands and rolled on the floor. He had won. Life has few joys like that hour of victory. The rings had little value as pieces of steel, but his triumph over self was worth millions to him and worth 1,000 millions to his country. The next morning his parents were surprised to see him the first one at the breakfast table. He told of his solution of the puzzle and said to his astonished but delighted parents that he had loafed around long enough and that he had determined to take hold and do things. He asked for an especially hard place in the shop and entered that week on a noble, triumphant career, having few equals save those of like experience. His health became robust. His work became profitable. New business ideas were developed, and in a few years he controlled the inside business and far distanced all outside competitors. He said to his wife, "I will have $1 million, and every dollar shall be a clean and honest dollar." In those days $1 million looked like a mountain of gold, but he secured the $1 million and steadily raised the pay of his workmen. He became the sheik of his town, the father and advisor of every local enterprise. He was sent to Congress by a nearly unanimous vote. For 11 years he was a safe counselor of the administration at Washington and was a close friend and trusted supporter of President Lincoln. One day in 1864, the Federal armies had been defeated by the Confederate forces and gloom shadowed the faces of the people. President Lincoln had a sleepless night. It looked like defeat and disunion. The danger was greatly increased by the abandonment of the scheme to hold California to the Union by building a railroad through the mountainous wilderness of the Sierra Nevada and Rocky Mountains. The chief engineer who surveyed the route said that it could not be done because of the great cost. 3 great financiers had been consulted and refused to undertake the hopeless task. The great Massachusetts senator told Mr. Lincoln that there was just one man who could do that gigantic feat. The senator said to Lincoln, "If that congressman makes up his mind to do it, and it is left to him, he will do it. He is a careful man, but he has a will which seems to be irresistible." President Lincoln sent for the congressman and said, "A railroad to California now will be more than an army, and it will be an army in the saving of the Union. Will you build it?" The congressman asked for 3 weeks to think. Before the end of that time, he asked the Secretary of War to take his card to President Lincoln, then in Philadelphia. On the card was written, "I will." What a startlingly fascinating story from real life is the history of that mighty undertaking. Now when the traveler passes the highest point on that transcontinental railroad, 8,550 feet above the sea at Sherman, Wyoming, and lifts his hat before the monument erected to that memory of the civil nobleman and hero, he is paying his respect to the self-giving heart and mighty brain of the boy who conquered the 3 links. It may not be necessary to multiply illustrations of this vital question, but no one who lived in the journalistic circles of Washington subsequent to the Civil War can forget the power and fame of that feminine literary genius who, as the Washington correspondent of the New York Independent, wrote such brilliant letters. The fact that she bore the same name as the congressman we have mentioned, though no relative of his, does not account for this reference to her. She was nearly 33 years old when a divorce and the breaking up of her home left her poor, ill, and under the cloud of undeserved disgrace. Her acquaintances predicted obscurity, daily toil with her hands, and a life of lonely sorrow. Poor victim of sad circumstances. She had but little education and had been too full of cares to read the books of the day. Her start in the profession which she later so gracefully and forcibly adorned was the foremost topic in corners and cloakrooms at her largely attended literary receptions in Washington. She had been told by those who loved her that a divorced woman would be shunned by all cultured women and be the butt of ridicule for fashionable men, and that as she must earn a living, she should sew or embroider or act as a nurse. She certainly was too weak to wash clothes or care for a kitchen. But within her soul there was that yearning to do something worthwhile which seems given to almost every woman. Few women reach old age without feeling that somehow the great object of living has not been attained. The ambitions to which a man can give free wings, a woman must suppress or hide in deference to custom or competition. As yet, she has seldom under our civilization seemed to do her best or accomplish the one great ideal of her heart and intellect. While she has the same God-given impulses, visions, and sense of power, she builds no cathedrals, spans no rivers, digs no mines, founds no nations, builds no steamships, and seldom appears in painting, sculpture, banking, or oratory. She is conscious of the native talent, sees the ideals, but must hide them until it is too late. But this woman, from the interior of New York State, was an exception. Like Charlotte Bronte, she said, "I will write." Like the same great author, she had her rebuffs and returned manuscripts, and all the more since at that time women were unknown in the newspaper business. But her invariable answer to critics and discouraged friends was, "I will." When in 1883 she said, "I will" to the great editor who became her second husband, the President of the United States wrote a personal letter to say that, while he wished her joy, he could but admit that it would be a distinct loss to humanity to have such a brilliant genius hidden by marriage. In an automobile ride from Lake Champlain to New York, I saw the city of Burlington, Vermont, with its university, where Barnes had said, "I will." At St. Johnsbury, the whole city advertises Fairbanks, who said, "I will." At Brattleboro, the hum of industry ever repeats the name of the boy Esty, who said, "I will." At Holyoke, the powerful canal seemed to reflect the faces of Chase and Whitney, who, when poor men, said, "I will." At Springfield, the signs on the stores, banks, and factories suggest the young Chapin, who made the city prosperous with his "I will." At New Haven, Whitney's determination stands out in great streets and university buildings. Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, New Orleans, Atlanta, Raleigh, Niagara, Pittsburgh, and 100 American cities like them are the outcome of ideas with wills behind them in the heads of common men. If every man had in the last generation done all that it was in his power to do, what sublime things would stand before us now in architecture, commerce, art, manufactures, education, and religion. The very glimpse of that vision bewilders the mind. But the many will not to do, while the few great benefactors of the race will to do. My young friend, be thou among those who will with noble motives to do. Affirmations for Prosperity by Florence Scovel Shinn. Man comes into the world financed by God, with all that he desires or requires already on his pathway. This supply is released through faith and the spoken word. If thou canst believe, all things are possible. For example, a woman came to me one day to tell me of her experience in using an affirmation she had read in my book, The Game of Life and How to Play It. She was without experience but desired a good position on the stage. She took the affirmation, "Infinite Spirit, open the way for my great abundance. I am an irresistible magnet for all that belongs to me by divine right." She was given a very important part in a successful opera. She said, "It was a miracle due to that affirmation which I repeated hundreds of times." Affirmations. I now draw from the abundance of the spheres my immediate and endless supply. All channels are free. All doors are open. I now release the gold mine within me. I am linked with an endless golden stream of prosperity, which comes to me under grace in perfect ways. Goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of abundance forever. My God is a God of plenty, and I now receive all that I desire or require, and more. All that is mine by divine right is now released and reaches me in great avalanches of abundance, under grace in miraculous ways. My supply is endless, inexhaustible, and immediate, and comes to me under grace in perfect ways. All channels are free, and all doors fly open for my immediate and endless divinely designed supply. My ships come in over a calm sea, under grace in perfect ways. I give thanks that the millions which are mine by divine right now pour in and pile up under grace in perfect ways. Unexpected doors fly open, unexpected channels are free, and endless avalanches of abundance are poured out upon me under grace in perfect ways. I spend money under direct inspiration, wisely and fearlessly, knowing my supply is endless and immediate. I am fearless in letting money go out, knowing God is my immediate and endless supply. About the authors. Born in 1874 in Norway, Christian D. Larson became a popular New Thought and inspirational writer and speaker, admired throughout the United States for his work, The Optimist Creed, originally published in 1912 as Promise Yourself. In 1922, it was officially adopted as the Creed of Optimist International and today is quoted around the world. A native of Ireland, Joseph Murphy, 1898 to 1981, was a widely read and admired New Thought minister and writer, best known for his self-help classic, The Power of Your Subconscious Mind. Murphy wrote prolifically on the autosuggestive and metaphysical faculties of the human mind. His pamphlet, How to Attract Money, first appeared in 1955 and entered many editions. Napoleon Hill was born in 1883 in Virginia and died in 1970 after a long and successful career as a consultant to business leaders and as a lecturer and an author. His classic, Think and Grow Rich, is the all-time bestseller in its field, having sold tens of millions of copies worldwide, and setting the standard for today's motivational thinking. His piece, How Success Grows from Failure, first appeared in April 1921 in Napoleon Hill's magazine. Born in Missouri, George S. Clayson, 1874 to 1957, served in the United States Army during the Spanish-American War, and went on to found the company that produced the first-ever United States Road Atlas. He began publishing a series of pamphlets on success and prosperity in 1926, which were later collected and published as his millions-selling book, The Richest Man in Babylon. His 7 Remedies for a Lean Purse originally appeared in his 1937 book, Gold Ahead. Born in New Hampshire, Orison Swett Marden, 1850 to 1924, was orphaned at age 7 and worked throughout his childhood as a hired boy, going on to graduate from Boston University and Harvard. Marden published his first book, Pushing to the Front, in 1894 to great sales and acclaim. He went on to found Success magazine in 1897, which had a circulation of 500,000 readers. His After Failure, What? First appeared in his 1913 book, Training for Efficiency. James Allen was born in England in 1864. He took his first job at age 15 to support his family after his father was murdered while looking for work in America. Allen worked as a private secretary with various manufacturing companies until 1902, when he left to devote himself fully to writing. He is widely known for his classic, As a Man Thinketh, though he wrote many other well-received books before his death in 1912, the year Light on Life's Difficulties was published. Born in 1843 in Massachusetts, Russell H. Conwell was trained as a lawyer, served as a Union soldier, and worked as an international journalist. He was ordained and worked as a Baptist minister before founding Temple University in Philadelphia in 1884. He is widely known for his inspirational lecture and book, Acres of Diamonds, which he delivered before audiences more than 6,000 times before his death in 1925. What You Can Do with Your Willpower, one of his most powerful works, appeared in 1917. Florence Scovel Shinn, 1871 to 1940, was born in New Jersey in 1871 and spent many years working as an artist and illustrator of children's literature in New York City before publishing her New Thought classic, The Game of Life and How to Play It, in 1925. Her Affirmations for Prosperity appeared in her 1928 sequel, Your Word is Your Wand. This is Joel Fatinos. We hope that you've enjoyed this production of How to Prosper in Hard Times by Napoleon Hill, James Allen, Joseph Murphy, George S. Clayson, and others. This program was executive produced by Patty Peruse and produced and directed by Robert Kessler. How to Prosper in Hard Times is a production of Penguin Audio, a member of Penguin Group USA, Inc. Copyright 2009. All rights reserved. The book, How to Prosper in Hard Times, is available wherever Tarcher Penguin